Welcome to the Market Maker's Strategy video course. The main focus of this course will be the understanding of how large traders enter and exit their positions in the market, and how they manipulate retail traders in order to do so. This course will also focus a lot more on the practical side of things because that's a more effective way of learning this type of trading approach. There will be a little bit of theory also, so we can have the best of both theoretical and practical worlds. Without further ado, let's jump right into the first idea that we must understand in order to grasp the mechanics of how market makers act in the market. This first idea is the concept of cognitive biases and their inherent presence in all human beings. A cognitive bias is a lens through which we see the world. This metaphorical lens has the property of steering our thinking process in certain directions automatically, hence the name cognitive bias. Cognitive biases are a result of biological evolution over hundreds of thousands of years, and each and every one of these biases have an evolutionary reason to exist, otherwise they would not be naturally selected at all. The problem is that a lot of these cognitive biases are in a certain way obsolete to modern world activities. This happens because our society evolves and alters its complexity much faster than biological evolution is able to keep up. One of the ramifications of this is called the intelligence paradox because the same biases that enabled human beings to survive and develop complex societies and intelligence are the same biases that hinder this intelligence due to this discrepancy between how fast society evolves and how fast biological evolution shapes our nature. Without getting too deep about the origins and developments of the cognitive biases, for the purposes of this course we should focus on three main cognitive biases. The first one is called von Restorff effect, the second one is called reverse psychology, and the third is called bandwagon effect. These are the three cognitive biases that market makers take advantage of in various types of situations. In some way, these three biases function as different layers, which is something that adds to the complexity of how market makers act. In other words, we can analyze a manipulative maneuver in terms of the von Restorff effect alone, in terms of the reverse psychology bias alone, in terms of the bandwagon effect, and of course, we can analyze them together. In this first lecture we are going to see the theoretical definition of these three biases and their abstract representation. I feel this is a good start, so we can build on this foundation later with the various types of practical examples. If you fail to understand these things in theory, you will have a more difficult time understanding what happens in practice, so try to bypass the urge of jumping right into the practical examples. Let's begin by seeing what the von Restorff effect means. This is a cognitive bias that draws your attention to information that stands out in the middle of similar information. For example, if you see a price chart where the candles are all relatively the same size, and then all of a sudden, a massive candle appears, your attention will be automatically shifted towards that massive candle. In the first milliseconds of that massive candle formation, you cannot even control this impulse. That's basically a defense mechanism built into our brains. A few seconds after the candle formation, we are able to voluntarily choose to shift our attention to where we want. This is a crucial point because most retail traders are not even aware such thing exists. Market makers capitalize on this unawareness of most traders, and they can sometimes induce the creation of a candle like that on purpose with the goal of shifting the attention of retail traders from the important area in the chart. This can be considered the first step of a manipulation in the market, and it's similar to what a few magicians and con artists do. They shift the attention of the public to something that is not important while they do their trick in the place that no one is paying attention to. This is the classic sleight of hand. This is basically how market makers start their manipulations maneuvers. That's roughly speaking how the von Restorff effect plays out in this situation. The other cognitive bias involved in market manipulations is the so-called reverse psychology. The confusion generated by this cognitive bias is its biggest feature. That's exactly what market makers are after. They want retail traders to be insecure and confused about their positions. That's the case because they know very well that a confused trader is a lot more likely to start breaking the rules of his trade plan assuming there is one. The breaking of good rules about risk management and impulsive trading on the part of retail traders is how market makers feed themselves, and they know how to take advantage of these things in an almost scary way. Back to the reverse psychology bias, let's try to break down this idea in conceptual terms first. Reverse psychology advocates a certain behavior with the opposite quality of what is desired with the goal of making someone else act in the way it is truly desired. In other words, market makers make use of reverse psychology to make retail traders believe the market is going to go up, for example, but in reality, market makers want the market to go down. The opposite is also true, of course. Reverse psychology is a practical necessity for market makers because that's the only way they can hit clusters of orders, and hitting clusters of orders is a necessity to open extraordinarily large orders in any market. Don't worry about that for now because we are going to see what these terms mean later in the course. The third bias involved in this manipulative process is called the bandwagon effect, which is the notion that people tend to follow what appears to be the general consensus of the crowd, even when it's not obvious what this consensus might be. That's a demonstration of how powerful a bias like that can be because individuals will put their trust in the ability of the crowd to judge what's right and what's wrong. The bandwagon effect has a pretty clear evolutionary reason to exist, which is that individuals who tended to act in groups were more likely to survive in dangerous situations thousands of years ago. This is an oversimplification, of course, but that's the general idea. The problem is that the crowd that acts by impulse in the market is usually wrong and all over the place. In some sense, the immense crowd of retail traders is somehow unaware of its own power as a group, which is a strange little irony about the market. That happens because traders don't think about themselves as a group. They think about themselves as individuals, so you can imagine that retail traders are something like a crowd of people who is uninterested in the survival of the others. They just happen to be going in the same direction most of the time. The unfortunate nature of the bandwagon effect is that people tend to act by impulse when they see something that resembles an opportunity that they might be missing, so they jump on the bandwagon, so to speak, hence the name of the bias. Needless to say at this point, but market makers love the fact that most traders in the market act like that. In fact, the bandwagon effect is one of the major driving forces that catapult the market makers' positions to where they want them to be. All market makers must do is to create the illusion that there is an opportunity in the market that traders will feel like they will be missing. As I said earlier, these three cognitive biases are the primordial ways in which market makers apply their tricks in the market. The question that remains is why market makers need to employ such techniques in the market, and why can't they simply trade using regular contextual trading and market logic? They can certainly do that, and they probably reach market maker status through those techniques. However, market makers are playing a different game than retail traders. Their positions are so large that they cannot simply open a trade anywhere they want in the chart like retail traders do because there is often a lack of liquidity for that. Just as an example, market makers have positions that surpass thousands of standard lots in the market, and that's a lot of money. They cannot simply buy or sell such quantities without distorting the market too much and making their plan too obvious for everyone else. That's why they need to cover up their agenda in a rather cynical way by exploiting mental patterns that are guaranteed to be present in all traders. For this first lecture, it's important that we understand the three main cognitive biases that are exploited by market makers and how the intersection of these three elements are used as some sort of axis to twist and turn the intuitions of millions of retail traders all around the world. In this lecture we are going to try to see the market manipulation idea in a more conceptualized form. I believe it's important that we do that before jumping to the practical examples because the conceptual and theoretical comprehension of a complex idea is sometimes easier with metaphors. In this video I am going to use an old philosophical idea that fits perfectly to how market makers relate to the retail traders and to the market as a whole. This old philosophical idea is called the allegory of the cave, which can be found in Plato's Republic. The allegory consists of a few elements that will enable you to see clearly what market manipulations are about. Imagine that we have a cave, and inside this cave we have chained prisoners facing a blank wall. Behind the prisoners we have individuals who walk freely inside the cave carrying objects, and behind these individuals we have a fire. As you can see in the image, the light produced by the fire hits the objects carried by the individuals between the fire and the chained prisoners and form shadows on the blank wall. It's important to see that the blank wall is the only thing that the prisoners can see, so in this case, the wall and the shadows are the prisoners' reality. The shape of the shadows that appear on the blank wall influence directly what the prisoners think. Here is the interesting fact. The shadows and their shape are controlled by the individuals who walk freely inside the cave carrying the objects, and they can purposefully distort the shape of the shadows to make the prisoners think in a specific way. You probably can see where I'm going with this by now. It's scary how perfectly this metaphor fits to the situation between retail traders and market makers. In our little thought experiment here, the prisoners are analogous to the retail traders in the market. The shadows on the blank wall is the price action. By the way, shadows are bidimensional just like the price action is. The individuals carrying the objects between the fire and the wall are the market makers, and their ability to purposefully change the shape of the shadows is analogous to their psychological arsenal in relation to the retail traders. The objects being carried by the individuals who are analogous to the market makers can be considered as the true market. Remember the abstract example of the tridimensional object in the room corner that was used to explain the concept of contextual trading in the Fractal Flow Strategy video course. This idea is the key to understand why subjectivity is a practical necessity in the markets. In some way, the object in the room corner and the allegory of the cave are different ways of telling the same story, but the allegory of the cave has an extra layer of difficulty, which is the ability of the tridimensional objects to change the shape of their shadows with the goal of misleading the person who is trying to figure out what they are. Imagine that one of the individuals who are analogous to the market makers inside the cave are holding up a ruler in front of the fire. The ruler is obviously a tridimensional object, but its shadow on the blank wall is bidimensional of course. If the tridimensional ruler is rotated in front of the fire, its shadow will give the impression that its length is being shortened, but in reality, the tridimensional ruler is just being rotated. This is a subtle example of how market makers perform an act that looks like something obvious on the outside, but in reality, it's something completely different. Another example of how the market makers can try to shift the focus of retail traders is using the example of the cylinder in the room corner again. One of the shadows is a square and the other is a circle. One of the objects that can produce both shadows simultaneously is a cylinder. However, market makers can try to trigger the von Restorff effect by trying to draw the attention of retail traders to one of these shadows by making one of them extremely obvious. By comparing these two metaphorical ideas, we can see that things can start to get pretty complicated in the realm of market manipulations. If you thought that simple contextual trading was challenging, you might be reevaluating that feeling by now because the axis of the market maker's moves, which comes mainly from the intersection between those three cognitive biases we studied, adds a whole new complex dimension to the idea of contextual trading. The ultimate goal of this course is that you break the chains that are forcing you to see the shadows of price action. The way to do that is by knowledge of course, which is another point of agreement between the modern trading paradigm and the Plato's allegory of the cave. By acquiring the correct knowledge, you will be able to walk inside the cave and carefully observe what the true market is really like. Getting more to the practical elements of how market makers perform their tactics, we need to understand the ideas of market depth, liquidity pools and order clusters. Market depth is simply the amount of money necessary to move the market by one tick. This varies according to the market and also according to the area in the chart. Order clusters are areas in the chart where many orders are placed together due to widely known ideas about technical analysis. For example, traders who use obvious highs and lows to trigger trades usually place their stop losses in very obvious areas in the chart, and there is an enormous number of traders who do this. These order clusters serve as tipping points for market makers because it would be extremely wasteful, if not impossible, to actually drive the market by large quantities. This would be quite difficult even for the largest groups of market makers out there. When the market approaches an area where there is a cluster of stop orders, market makers only need to drive the market by a few ticks to trigger these immense clusters. Once they do that, a whole chain of psychological effects begin to take place in the minds of the stopped-out retail traders. For example, many traders who get their stop triggered immediately want to recover from their losses, so they will try to enter the market again in the opposite direction. This is something that actually helps the market makers drive their positions to their desired side. This is also part of the reverse psychology dimension of these manipulative games. Once again, don't worry too much about not understanding how all these things work in combination right now. It will get clearer in the practical examples. When we look at the charts, we have an intuition that the market is completely flat and that all market levels are equal. Nothing could be further from the truth. One of the jobs of a highly skilled trader or speculator is to identify the market levels that are deeper than others because those are the levels that will impact price the most. These are also the levels that will form market edges in the future. You might be wondering how these clusters end up being formed, and the logic behind that is quite simple. The clusters are formed by millions of retail traders believing the same axioms about standard technical analysis. There is a huge amount of people who attempt to trade the market in a rather impulsive and reckless way, and they only use the most obvious places in the chart to place a stop-loss order. Needless to say, market makers love that fact because it makes their life so much easier. For example, too many people place their stops a few pips above or below an obvious entry level, like the break of a high or a low in the market. This is probably the most obvious way in which market makers can steer these people. The cynical fact is that these people are miles away from even being aware that they are being manipulated on a psychological level. This is also one of the reasons why it's so important to study behavioral economics, because you can learn how to identify certain emotions in real time, which can prevent you from falling in the same psychological pitfalls repeatedly. Once again, market makers are highly skilled in this type of job. They are like con artists of the financial market. They can create illusions without even appearing on the stage. If there is a game that is worth learning about, this is probably the one. When price reaches a cluster of orders, a liquidity pool is created, which is nothing more than an enormous amount of supply or demand depending to which side this happens. When there is a huge supply or demand, market makers can get extremely large positions in the market without being noticed, and without changing price action too much. Simultaneously, market makers capitalize on the retail traders' necessity to recover from their stopped-out positions. The huge mass of retail traders who are constantly looking for revenge in the market is actually a necessary force to drive the market makers' positions in their desired direction. Ironically, market makers need retail traders to create those obscene amounts of profit and finish their twisted little game. Most retail traders are really not happy when they find out about this, but there is actually no one to blame. Market makers are playing a fair game. The ethics of this game is obviously questionable, but there is nothing illegal about this because it's based on a feature of the underlying supply and demand mechanism of the markets. The issue is that this inherent feature of the market only appears when the underlying mechanism of supply and demand of the markets is taken to an extreme, which is precisely what market makers attempt to do. Beyond the ideas of market depth, order clusters and liquidity pools, we also must understand that there are several types of retail traders in the market. The most common and obvious example are the retail traders that operate with a raw intuition about highs and lows of the market. However, we have retail traders that watch several widely known technical indicators like moving averages, for example. Large traders can also use the main ideas surrounding these indicators to manipulate their users. We can extrapolate this situation to basically all concepts of technical analysis that have a sufficient degree of fame. I will try to illustrate that in the practical examples of this course. The reason for this should be simple to you at this point. Any tool that has a significant amount of people trusting it in the market is a potential manipulation tool for the large traders because the axis of thinking that these large traders will employ do not change. The only thing that changes is the place that people will place their stop orders, which is a relatively small detail if you compare with the psychological steering process that is involved in all manipulations. In this lecture we are going to learn about a drawing tool called the wash line. This is a tool especially derived from the way large traders manipulate retail traders on the chart. In other words, there is no other way of learning about a wash line other than by first understanding how and where manipulations occur in the price chart. In this lecture we are going to observe the conceptual form of the wash line. The application of this drawing tool will be observed in the practical examples. Without further ado, let's jump right into the concept of the wash line. The unusual name of this drawing tool is obviously related to an aspect of the manipulation of markets. The wash line is the line that pinpoints the level wherein retail traders were washed out of their positions. In other words, the level wherein they were manipulated. This is useful to draw on a chart because often the large traders come back to this level, and a trade opportunity might arise out of this. A market manipulation needs two different market extremes to be identified in the lowest possible resolution, meaning that we need at least two highs or two lows to identify a market manipulation without worrying too much about the nuances of candlesticks and all of that. Keep in mind that this low-resolution analysis is only valid when we are trying to draw a wash line. The identification of the actual manipulation requires a high-resolution view of the market under the tridimensional axis we already covered. If we think about this stuff for a moment, we will realize that a manipulation occurs when large traders induce retail traders to trade in one direction with the goal of actually driving the market in the opposite direction. The whole manipulation results in a spike in price that violates a previous high or low, and that does not close above or below this previous high or low. The wash line is a horizontal line that has its origins in the high or low that was spiked or pierced. In this illustration we can see price approaching a high where an order cluster will probably exist as a result of retail breakout traders willing to go long in that particular high. Price will spike that high without closing above it, and then it will move down, often creating a new low. At this point we can draw a wash line. The starting point is the high that was poked, meaning the high where retail traders were washed out of their positions. Observe that the candle spike itself creates a very good place for a stop-loss order. Oftentimes you will notice that price comes back to the level of the wash line. It's important to observe what price does if it comes back there, and if you find signs that price is respecting that line and slowing down, you can think about a trade opportunity. The same exact situation obviously happens in the opposite market direction, but all the elements are mirrored. In this lecture we are going to conceptually define the idea of organized behavior on a price chart. The notion that financial markets are complex is not new, and it has its origins on the fact that price is the ultimate representation of a multivariate entity. In other words, the normal behavior of price tends to be chaotic since the price chart is a condensation of an enormously complex entity that we call market. Based on this idea, we can take advantage of the moments where price seems to behave in an organized way. The idea of organized behavior in a price chart is directly related to the idea of market intervention and market manipulation, and it's one of the fingerprints that large traders leave in price. Organized behavior that is purposefully generated is usually employed as a weapon to generate the von Restorff effect. In other words, when traders see price behaving in a certain way, they assume unconsciously that there is not much doubt about the immediate future of price. I say unconsciously because most traders have no idea that markets suffer from manipulation in the way we are talking about in this course. If you remember the first lectures of the course, you will remember that the von Restorff effect is grounded on an automatic response. In other words, our attention is naturally attracted to something that stands out, so if we see an organized behavior in the middle of an apparently chaotic behavior, that's where our attention will go. However, the fact that our attention shifts like that is not the real problem. The problem is how we deal with this phenomenon. If you don't know how large traders operate, your focus will be modulated according to this bias, and you will not even notice it. If you are aware there is such a thing called von Restorff effect and you can sort of see it from the outside perspective, you will gain an advantage over the other traders because you will be able to recognize how this bias will be used to mislead traders. Let's try to define what the organized behavior in price is in a conceptualized manner. The way this price pattern usually emerges is by respecting a few simple guidelines. These guidelines are that each and every candle produces a higher high and a higher low in the case of an upward movement, or a lower high and a lower low in the case of a downward movement. The other guideline is that the volatility of these candles seems to be similar in most cases. These are guidelines, which means that they are not rules. This is what generally happens, but it does not have to be exactly like that. That's the way this price pattern appears, roughly speaking. The most important thing is that you become capable of identifying an apparently chaotic and natural price behavior, and the difference to an organized price behavior. The difference should be quite clear in a price chart if you look close enough. This is one of the reasons why you should not have too much price information on the chart to start your analysis, otherwise you will not be able to zoom close enough to see these price nuances. In this lecture we are going to talk about the idea of press zones, which is another signature of large traders that can be useful for identifying manipulations, and subsequent trade opportunities. The press zone is a signature like the organized behavior, meaning that large traders have no other choice but to leave these marks in price. This is good news for the traders who train themselves to see these subtle nuances in price as we are attempting to do in this course. A press zone is a specific configuration of candle tails that usually happen before a point of ignition in the chart. In other words, it's a specific configuration of candlestick tails that happen before the moment where price explodes its volatility. There is a good reason for that, and it has to do with the name of this market maker signature. The name press zone comes from the fact that large traders usually need to press the market until it tilts after a certain point beyond their control. That means that these large traders will pound the tails of certain candlesticks in order to create this effect. If they do that enough, unconscious market psychology will take care of the rest. What I mean by that is that large traders sometimes can try to press the market upwards, for example, so they will start pounding the lower tails of each candle until the majority of the market realizes that the market should go up. When that happens, there is usually a burst of volatility to the upside. The press zone is similar to a cliff in some sense. Imagine that there are retail traders at the edge of a cliff. What large traders do with a press zone is to nudge the retail traders off the cliff. Once they fall, they cannot stop until they hit the ground. That's roughly speaking what happens with these market signatures. Let's try to observe conceptually what these press zones look like in the chart. There are two guidelines that you must observe in a press zone. The first one is the occurrence of subsequent higher lows in the case of a press zone upwards, or the occurrence of lower highs in the case of a press zone downwards. The second guideline is the occurrence of an increase in volatility after the press zone. The precise moment that we see the volatility expanding is called the point of ignition for obvious reasons. As you might be wondering already, you can draw a zone out of this price signature. The limits of the zone should be placed in the point of ignition and where the candle tails started to get pounded. This zone can be considered as a place where we have high supply or demand. Essentially, this is a buy or sell zone that can be used later in the analysis. If the surrounding context helps, we can think about trading in these areas when price comes back to them. This is why we can often observe price reversing in previous points of ignition. Remember that this is just one element of a well-constructed context, and it's not a good idea trying to trade using just this idea, although that can work sometimes just like with any other isolated tool. As we discussed deeply in the Fractal Flow Strategy video course, the principle of contextual trading is at the top of the hierarchy of trading principles. It's the most important thing technically speaking. In this lecture we are going to talk about an incredibly powerful concept that will open your eyes to all sorts of details in price action that most traders simply don't see. The reasons they don't see such details is that they are not aware of the idea of frequency in price action. Most traders are worried about finding a good moving average value or observing how raw price action interacts with tools in that class. Instead of looking at how price interacts with shallow tools, a trader should observe how price interacts with itself in particular ways. Without getting too philosophical about the idea of frequency in price action, we must approach this concept with the notion that frequency can be defined as the rate at which something occurs. With that in mind, we can say that a frequency line is a line that catches the rate at which something occurs in price action. This is a powerful idea because these frequencies can show specific angles or levels in price that cannot be derived in any other way, roughly speaking. In the particular case of price action, we are specifically interested in the frequency of candlestick tails. The reason for that is that candlestick tails hold a lot of information about the internal chain of causality of candlesticks. As limited as that source of information can be, that's the best we can do in a price chart, and it's amazing how precise this idea can be in reality. The idea here is that we want to catch the underlying frequency of a series of candle tails. There are two ways of doing this. The first way is catching this frequency with a horizontal line, and the second is catching this frequency with a sloped line. Let's begin with the horizontal line first because that's the easiest one to learn. To catch the frequency of a series of candlestick tails, you have to tie all of them in a way that the frequency line does not surpass the open or close values of the candles in question. Notice that this line points to a level that is different than the absolute extreme. To draw a sloped frequency line, you have to use the same idea, but with the added rule that the line must tie all candle tails in question in an angled way. These frequency lines are very useful to pinpoint precise reversal points in the immediate future of price. If you combine them with other ideas like press zones, normal buy or sell zones and things like that, you will have a good set of precise tools to trade near the edges of the market. Notice how both the horizontal and the sloped frequency lines catch all those candlestick tails by pinpointing what they have in common, which is very different than linking two market extremes together. This requires some practice, but once you learn it you will not be able to not see these lines anymore, which is a good thing generally speaking. In this lecture we are going to explore the concept of the sloped wash line, which is nothing more than a combination between the regular horizontal wash line and the idea of frequency lines. The combination of these concepts can sometimes form a powerful drawing tool that will serve the purpose of highlighting reversal points in advance. This is exactly what everybody interested in technical analysis is after. A tool that is able to see beyond the present with high accuracy. Just as a recapitulation, we have to remember that a normal wash line is a horizontal level that marks the moment in which retail traders got washed out of their positions in the market. The frequency line is a line that catches the underlying frequency among a particular set of candlestick tails. Frequency lines can be horizontal or sloped as we saw in the previous lecture. A sloped wash line is simply a line that uses the main characteristics of both horizontal wash lines and frequency lines at the same time. The reason we use such line is that sometimes price does not come back to the horizontal wash line level, but it reverses somewhere else. That can leave traders a little bit frustrated because they expect price to always come back to the horizontal wash line level. This type of situation can be considered a thing that can only be sorted out in real time by seasoned professionals, but it is useful to know how it works right from the start. The formal definition of a sloped wash line is the following. It's a line that blends the main characteristics of a horizontal wash line and a frequency line with the goal of pinpointing a different level in which the market might reverse. To know in real time which of these levels will actually be the correct level depends on the trader observing how price behaves when it reaches one of such levels. Let's see an example of how the sloped wash line might appear in a price chart. In this example we can see that number 1 was the level that was used as the axis for the manipulation that occurred in number 2. Based on that, we can draw the yellow wash line using number 1 as the origin. To draw the sloped wash line in this situation, we have to use the same axis in number 1 as the origin of our line, and we have to draw a frequency line across highs 1 and 2 simultaneously. Notice how the red sloped line catches the frequency of all those upper tails in a way that the underlying frequency or angle in this case is exposed. To see which one of these lines price will actually respect, we have to wait until price gets there and see how it behaves. If price reaches the line and starts to display things like inside candles and starts to test the line a few times, we can start thinking about using the line with other contextual elements to form a trade idea. In our little example here, we have an inside candle in number 3 that happens to be testing the sloped wash line for the second time with its upper tail. These are the details you should be looking for when price gets near these lines. In the candle after number 3, observe that price touches the sloped wash line once again with its upper tail. An experienced trader would use that third touch to get in a short position in an almost perfect location as you can see, but you can also enter at the open of the next candle for example. In this lecture we are going to go over a step-by-step process on how to identify manipulative maneuvers in the market. Keep in mind that these instructions are only low-resolution guidelines that should make your life easier if you are starting to learn the market maker's strategy. What I mean by that is that every step that I am going to outline must be unpacked into a high-resolution analysis, and many of the steps are subjective. However, a low-resolution guideline can have some utility. I am also going to assume that you have a firm grasp of the tridimensional axis of market manipulation, the ideas of liquidity pools, market depth, order clusters, the various types of lines you can draw under this methodology, and the recognition of the price signatures left by large traders. If you don't understand these concepts well, I suggest that you go back to the previous lectures and review them or send me an email to clarify your doubts. The very first step is to decide the amount of price information you will have available on the chart. If you have too much past information, you will be dealing with irrelevant events, and you will not be able to zoom in price action to see the individual candlesticks' nuances that are so important. On the other hand, if you don't use enough price information, your analysis will lack the necessary threshold for a good contextual story for your trade. One good rule here is that you should not have less than 100 candles on your chart, and you should not have more than 200 candles as well. That seems to be a good starting point. There are exceptions to this rule, but for most cases this should give you a good idea of how much past information you should look at. Let me remind you also that this rule remains constant independently of the timeframe you trade. The second step is to make sure that you maintain yourself in the timeframe that you have chosen previously without shifting back and forth to check for new information. That seems like a good idea at first, but it has disastrous consequences. The motivation for these two first steps is to limit the scope of your analysis, which is something that increases your focus. If you don't define these things carefully, you will not even start your analysis correctly most of the time. The third step is to mark and count the highs and lows on your chart. This is really important because without a clear view of the highs and lows in the chart, you will not be able to see manipulations properly, since it's all about the relationship between price extremes. I suggested that you number the highs and lows so you can make quick references when you write on the chart. This is something that helps maintaining things neatly organized. The fourth step is to imagine what the retail traders might be thinking in the current market scenario. Observe that you will attempt to think like a retail trader for a specific reason. You will not be acting like a retail trader for reasons that should be obvious to you at this point. That means looking for the highs or lows that retail traders might be considering a good place to put buy or sell orders. This is a relatively straightforward thing to do. Once you have completed step number 4, you can move on to step number 5, which is where the fun really begins. In this step you will be looking for the price signatures that will give you a subjective sense that market makers are indeed trying to motivate retail traders to buy or sell a specific high or low. These price signatures are of course the things you would find under the von Restorff effect. You have to pay attention to subtle things like market makers trying to press price, the sudden increases in volatility and things of that nature. Paying attention to the candlestick's tails is also very helpful, since they often shed some light about the buying and selling pressures of the levels where they occur. This is an incredibly important step, and it's also a subjective one. That's what I mean by a low-resolution guideline in the beginning. Step number 6 is to observe how price behaves once it breaks the high or low that you identified as a possible axis for the manipulation. In this step you should be looking for candle nuances like the way candle tails behave in relationship to the high or low that was broken. Here is where you must be able to identify the end of the von Restorff effect and the beginning of the reverse psychology and bandwagon effects taking place. Step number 7 is to observe how price reacts after the alleged manipulation. You should be able to pinpoint signs that indicate the market is going in the opposite direction of what the retail traders previously thought. Here you will be once again looking for nuances like shifts in volatility and the creation of new highs and lows. It's important that you are capable of telling a logically consistent story of how the manipulation took place. Step number 8 is to draw the various types of lines you learned in previous lectures, so you can try to identify possible levels where a trade opportunity might arise. This is where you have to be creative and use other tools like support and resistance lines, and even other methodologies like the fractal flow, for example. The more elements you have pointing to the same area in the chart, the better and stronger the signal is going to be. Step number 9 is where you will be combining the line work with the contextual story about the manipulation to form a trade idea. These are the two fundamental elements that must be present in your analysis. You cannot look for just technical setups to trade a methodology like this, because it's based on market logic and trading psychology more than anything. That's why looking for good lines only will lead to failure. It might work once in a while, but it will fail eventually. Step number 10 is choosing the entry, stop loss and target for your trade. The stop loss in this methodology always revolves around the candle that spiked the high or low that was allegedly manipulated. That's almost always the case. The target can be a combination of line work of various sorts, but if you want to keep things simple, you should make it between 3 and 4 times as large as the stop loss. It's also better if this predefined target correlates more or less with a previous market level that has some degree of significance, like a previous major high or low. Triggering the trade is a little bit trickier because many traders require an absolute black and white signal to do that. The first thing I would suggest for beginners and intermediate level traders is to wait candles to close before pulling the trigger. You can enter the trade after an inside candle or an outside candle, for example. A fractal candle is also a very good idea. The idea is that you identify a momentary stop in price, then you can employ a variety of methods to enter. Step 11 is to let the trade run its course. There is a good reason we plan things so well in advance, which is to avoid real-time improvisation in decisions that involve risk. If you decide to change your trade after it's opened, you will make decisions that are more biased than what they should be, and this is something that always ends in disaster. It's important that you maintain a solid trading ethic, unlike the retail traders who are very sloppy about their operational rules. These 11 guidelines should be enough to put you on the correct track, roughly speaking, but as I said in the beginning, they are a low-resolution representation of what you should be doing. If that was not the case, we would not need the other lectures in this course to fully understand the market maker mentality. You still have to study all the details of the methodology as hard as you can, to the point where you internalize them, and they become second nature to you. In this lecture we will go over a few different ways to trigger a trade after you already have built the correct context for a high-quality trade opportunity. I feel the need to emphasize once again that these trade triggers I will show you will not work by themselves. They only work if you use them in the correct context, otherwise trading would be a lot easier than what it actually is. I talk to many traders that are stubborn to understand this idea. They only want a setup or a way to get in and out of the market as quickly as possible. I guess all traders want that, especially the ones that are in the beginning of their careers, but it's necessary to understand that what traders want does not have anything to do with how the market actually works. In other words, just because you want something, it does not mean that you can make it happen in the exact way you wish. In reality, you have to find the intersection between what you want and what reality allows you to do in a way that this exercise becomes sustainable across time, and that's certainly a challenge. The way professional traders achieve this point of equilibrium is by employing setups only when they find themselves inside the correct context. It's important also that setups don't become arbitrary. There must be an underlying logic for us to really trust them. However, even after learning and understanding what I'm saying here, you will still have the will to forget it and to just use the simple setups. That's natural because we all want to make our lives easier. That's built into our biology and has been for a long time. It's actually one of the reasons we survived as a species. What you have to understand is that there are several different situations in modern life where we have to fight these primal impulses if we want to succeed. Let me warn you right now that if you decide to use these setups without analyzing the market first and without building the correct context, you will absolutely fail as a trader. It might work here and there, but in the overall picture you will be setting yourself up for failure. I hope you really listen to what I'm trying to say here, because this is meant to help you in the best way possible. There are basically two fundamental ways of triggering a trade. One is opening trades at the very open value of a specific candle, and the second is opening trades while a specific candle is forming. The first method is more appropriate for beginner and intermediate students because it's just easier, but it has the disadvantage of being less precise. The second method is usually employed by advanced traders. It's more difficult, but it can be as precise as it ever gets. In both methods you need to pay attention to how candles behave in the levels that you identified with your context. Let's imagine, for simplicity's sake, that you identified a line that represents a level in which buyers seem to be present and willing to appear again in the chart. The first thing that is interesting to notice is if price is going to respect this line. We can tell this is happening when price touches the line but does not violate it. If price is actually going to respect such level, it will generate a momentary stop of some sort. Momentary stops usually generate inside candles in the chart, or at least candles that do not advance price too much. An inside candle is a candle that is completely constrained inside the range of the immediately previous candle. This is another sign that our buyers are still holding and willing to help us. It's important to notice that the inside candle can form a second touch to the line in our example. That would be even better evidence in agreement with our trade idea. This is the moment where the majority of traders will decide that it is time to open a trade, then they will choose between the two fundamental methods of doing that. You could wait for the next candle to open, or you can try to place a buy order at the line with the expectation that price will touch it a third time. This is mere speculation, of course, and it might not happen at all, but if it does, it would be a more precise entry. Another thing that might happen is the appearance of an outside candle, which is exactly the opposite of an inside candle. In other words, the total range of the outside candle completely engulfs the range of the immediately previous candle. If in this case we have an outside bullish candle after our inside candle, we would have yet another indication to pull the trigger. You could open the trade at the open of the next candle or wait to trigger the line. It's difficult to come up with exact rules of how you are supposed to trigger a trade because price always does something different, so it's hard to condense all the possibilities of price nuances in static rules. Another price action formation that can happen, and it does happen quite frequently in reversal points, is the fractal candle. If you are interested in learning what a fractal candle is, check out the Fractal Flow Strategy video course because that requires a longer explanation that has nothing to do with the market maker strategy. Let's summarize what you need to pay attention to while looking for opportunities to pull the trigger on your trades. First, you must be aware of which of the two triggering methods you will be using. The second thing is to observe how price will interact with the elements that you defined in the contextual part of the analysis, like lines or zones. You must pay attention at how price touches and respects those levels, and also what types of candles appear. These 2 or 3 candles right before a trade being opened is almost like a micro-context on its own because there is a little story going on, and it must make sense according to market logic. You cannot pull the trigger after an inside candle just because I am telling you that this is okay to do. You must understand why this is valid, then you will have the confidence to do that without needing to trust what I say. You will need to trust yourself before trusting someone else. Needless to say at this point, but to trigger a trade you must have a predefined context, a stop-loss idea and a target idea. All of these elements must allow you to have the possibility of closing a successful trade with 1 to 3 risk-reward ratio most of the time. Welcome to the practical portion of the Market Maker course. In this section we are going to apply all the theory that we saw in the previous lectures, but this will be done in a more comprehensive and nuanced way. What I mean by that is that in order for you to really grasp how market manipulations occur, you need to be exposed to several different practical examples. The theory is not enough to understand how these things play out in real charts. In this video, I'm going to analyze one of the live trades I posted in the YouTube channel, but here I will analyze it completely under the light of the market maker strategy. The same exact trade could be placed using the fractal flow strategy. It's interesting to notice how these two methodologies can point to the exact same points in the chart. Without further ado, let's begin the analysis. The first thing you should notice in this chart is that we have a downward flow, which is recognized by the lower lows and lower highs of this market, which are marked by the short blue horizontal lines. In this chart we have also 2 points of manipulation. The first will serve as a target point for the trade you see opened in the chart, and the second one in the lower section of the chart is used as a trigger and for the stop-loss placement. The first manipulation is marked in number 1, which points to that massive candlestick going down. I'm going to go through all the steps of the manipulation so you can see how this works in practice. Regardless of what the market is doing, we always have retail traders who are looking for places to go long and places to go short. There is quite a lot of people who look at obvious highs and lows in the chart and believe those are good places to buy or sell. That comes from a raw intuition that when price surpasses a high, it has momentum to continue up, and when price surpasses a low, it has momentum to continue down. That's correct up to a certain point, but using these areas as places to trigger a trade is wildly dangerous, as you are about to see. Going back to some of the principles of the fractal flow method, buying in highs and selling in lows is wrong because we have very poor trade location, meaning that these places are usually far away from the market edges. Let's analyze what happened between number 0 and number 1. Price had just made a lower low, but regardless of that undeniable fact, there were retail traders that were ready to buy when and if price surpassed the high number 0. In other words, in the area of high number 0, we have a cluster of orders from retail traders that believe that if the market breaks that level, it will continue to go up much further. Large traders are aware that these retail traders think that way, so in this specific case, they drove price up to the order cluster to trigger the long orders. When price hit that level of the order cluster, an immense amount of people bought the market, and that's the window of opportunity that large traders have to sell the market and successfully employ their maneuver. One very important thing to understand also is that those retail traders that went long at the break of high number 0 usually place their stops a few pips below the break point. They do this because they think that this sort of thing reduces their risk, which is obviously not the case. Right after large traders hit the order cluster and the long positions were triggered, these large traders get in the market as violently as they can to the opposite side, which in this case is the short position. Before we move on to the other steps, you should be able to realize that the moments that precede the break of high number 0 is what we called the von Restorff effect in the theoretical portion of the course. When price is near that point, all that those retail traders willing to go long can pay attention to is the high number 0. They completely ignore the fact that price is producing lower highs and lower lows. After the large traders get in the market with as much violence as they can, the market obviously starts to go down, and this is where the reverse psychology and bandwagon effect begin to take place. Those stopped-out retail traders now realize that they were wrong, and they are ready to recuperate their loss by jumping in the other direction of the market. This is the reverse psychology part of the manipulation because the large traders can only trigger this revenge mechanism in the retail traders by inducing them to the opposite side first. The bandwagon effect begins to take place when a huge mass of retail traders starts to jump into the short side of the market. Needless to say, at this point the enormous amount of people who attempt to scalp the market to the downside in a situation like this only helps the market maker's position to head in the profitable position. This is how a market manipulation usually takes place when we deal with retail traders that look at highs and lows as good entry points. The aftermath of the manipulation is very simple. The high number 0, which was the level used as a tipping point, represents now the upper limit of where large sellers might appear again, and the open of candle 1 represents the lower limit. You will understand why that's important later on in the analysis. After the manipulation in number 1, observe that the market resumes its original downward trend, which is what retail traders should be paying attention to this whole time. The other manipulation maneuver in this chart happens in the lower section in number 5 to be precise. It can be considered as the exit strategy of the large sellers from the first manipulation, or it can be considered a manipulation on itself. The analysis tends to be the same regardless of which of those possibilities holds water. Although this second manipulative maneuver tends to almost mirror the first one, there are a few differences. The section of the manipulation where the von Restorff effect occurs is a bit different because it happened in the direction of the trend. That's the case because the manipulation now will tend to reverse the direction of the trend because the market is losing momentum to the downside, and those large sellers need to dump their large positions at some point. In the second manipulation, the von Restorff effect happens in number 4, which is an outside bearish candle pointing to the downside and giving the impression that the market will continue to go down. This element fills the retail traders who are waiting to go short at the break of low number 3 with hope that the market will plummet even more. At this point, the manipulation exactly mirrors the first one. Large traders purposefully drive the market down to the level 3 where there is a huge cluster of sell orders. Once the market gets there, a deep liquidity pool is created by the triggering of these short orders, and the large traders, who are now looking to go long, enter the market with an enormous amount of long positions without distorting the market too much. Remember that market makers need these deep liquidity pools to enter their positions without being noticed too much. The lower tail of candlestick number 5 represents the market makers entering the market to the upside. At this point, those poor retail traders who sold the market at level 3 are already stopped out, and they are all ready to take revenge and go long. You might be thinking that these retail traders can actually recuperate the loss of their first trade, but that happens to be false most of the times for one very simple reason. Retail traders like the ones we are dealing with here are always operating under the hyperbolic discounting paradigm. In other words, once they see some profit appearing on their trading terminal, especially after a loss, they tend to close the orders. These traders have no rules about risk management and they act almost completely by impulse. Observe how the manipulation followed the same steps again. Large traders created a distraction with the candlestick 4, then they fulfilled the hopes of the retail traders who wanted to short low number 3 as a reverse psychology maneuver. By hitting the order cluster and getting to the opposite side of the market, the large traders finish the reverse psychology effect and trigger the bandwagon effect to help drive their positions to the desired direction. Based on that, we can safely assume that this market is probably going to go up, so we simply enter the market with a long position at the open of the very next candle. The stop loss in the market maker strategy is logical as well. It should go below the absolute extreme of the candlestick that was the axis of the manipulation, which in this case was the candlestick number 5. The target can be placed in the lower limit of the other opposite manipulation that took place between levels 0 and the open of candle 1. Here we can see that our trade was successful, and we were able to detect the market maker's maneuvers. One of the advantages of being able to see these things in real time is that these market manipulations often point to flow shifts in the trend, which happen to be difficult to see with other methodologies. As you can probably notice at this point, the market maker's strategy can serve as another layer to the contextual trading principle of the fractal flow method. This is a very good way of enriching your analysis of the market and taking advantage of what the large traders of the market are doing. In this lecture we are going to analyze a long trade in the USD yen. This example has a little bit of complexity involved in it, and it's not the easiest example of market manipulation you will find. The reason for that is the complex line work involved and the rather violent price behavior for both sides of the market. Without further ado, let's jump right into the analysis. From number 1 to number 4 you can see the market clearly rising in what we usually call the major flow, but from number 4 to number 5, some different things happen to confuse the majority of traders attempting to trade this market. The first thing you should notice here is that the vector from 4 to 5 represents the formation of an expanding pivot. That's because 4 is higher than 2 and 5 is lower than 3. This tends to confuse the natural intuition that higher highs and higher lows produce an uptrend and that lower highs and lower lows produce a downtrend. At point number 5, there is a lot of indecision in the minds of traders who follow this simple notion of highs and lows to roughly determine the trend. However, in the minds of retail traders that look for highs to buy and lows to sell, the break of low number 3 represents a selling opportunity that was indeed fulfilled. What these retail traders fail to realize is that vector 5 was intentionally driven down by large traders because they know that there was a cluster of sell orders right below the low number 3 as a result of retail traders who attempt to go short in these obvious breakout points. The very first confirmation sign that this was a tipping point for large traders to throw retail traders off the cliff was candle number 5. Observe how violently candle 5 returns to price levels above low number 3. Candle 5 was exactly the moment where large traders got into this market after creating a deep liquidity pool by hitting the cluster of orders that used to live below number 3. The series of green arrows you can see on the chart represent the mildly organized behavior I talked about briefly in the theoretical portion of the course. This organized behavior is a sign that large traders are actively pushing the market higher and higher with each candle that is formed. You can see how far they went with this by looking at the volatility of those bullish candles marked by the green arrows. However, before we move on to the next steps of this manipulation, let's roll back to its very beginning where the von Restorff effect took place. In this specific case, the von Restorff effect was quite subtle, and it happened from point 4.4 onwards. Observe that the market starts cascading down after that point. This gets the retail traders who were looking to go short in low 3 all agitated and excited about the strength of the market on the way down. Needless to say, this is all a theatrical maneuver to trigger precisely this sort of reckless and impulsive excitement in the less educated traders. The market vector from 5 to 6 creates yet another expanding pivot formation because 5 is lower than 3 and 6 is higher than 4. Similarly to what happened to those retail traders in number 5, the retail traders who were looking to go long at the break of high number 4 got exactly the same treatment from number 6 onwards. Both sides of the market ended up being washed out of their positions, so you might ask where exactly we are supposed to trade here. When it comes to trading market manipulations, the devil is always in the details, and the places where you can get in the market are not always obvious since this is a complicated game to master. This is where we have to employ the principles of complex line work and reverse engineering of market contexts. If you observe on the chart, we have a few sloping lines drawn at specific places. In a first moment, these lines might appear to be randomly drawn, but that's not the case at all. The first set of lines I want you to pay attention to are the two upsloping black lines. The first line comes out of high 4.4 and extends itself until high number 6. The reason behind that is that 4.4 was the very beginning of the manipulation in the subtler von Restorff effect we talked about. High number 6 can be considered as the last leg of the manipulation. Observe also that an upsloping black line with the same exact angle was drawn in low 4.5. You might be wondering why this line was placed there, and the reason is that that was the last low before retail traders got maneuvered. Beyond that, drawing lines in the last minor extreme before a major extreme can be useful to identify secondary entries in the market. The other set of lines you can see are the orange lines. The first one comes out of 4 and extends until 6. A line with the exact same angle was drawn out of low 3. These are just the most important extremes of price action if we don't count the manipulation in number 5. Observe that these two sets of lines converge to a same point marked by the second red square. Notice also that the lower orange line acts as a non-obvious sloping support and resistance line if you pay attention to the small tails along the way. I talked about the idea of reverse engineering your entry and exit points. This is what I'm referring to when I talk about these sloping lines. You can find almost an infinite number of these lines on the chart, but only a very limited number of them will correlate and converge to a same point like you see here. The other element that enriches this context is the set of lower tails right above the second red rectangle. These lower tails give the impression that there is some sort of barrier in that level, and this barrier seems to be giving support to the upside. Finally, the last element that you should consider is the outside candle marked by the vertical gray line. This clearly shows intent to the upside after both long and short retail traders were washed out of their positions. The trade you see opened in the chart was triggered at the open of the very next candle with a stop below the low of the outside candle. Just as an observation, this outside bullish candle is also a fractal candle by the light of the fractal flow method, so if you understand how both methods work, you would have yet another layer of confirmation to enter this trade. The target was placed around high number 6 level to give about 1 to 3 risk-reward ratio. Let's see how the market responds. Here we can clearly see the outcome of our long position. One very important point about these manipulations is that sometimes, we have to wait for both sides of the market to get hurt in some way or another, and then we can act, otherwise we will end up being hurt as well. In this example, you could see that after both sides were whipsaw, the smoke cleared and we had headroom to make a profit without being maneuvered. In this lecture we are going to be looking at a market manipulation example that occurred in the British pound versus the Japanese yen in the 1-hour timeframe. This can be considered an intermediate level trade because the analysis cannot be categorized as simple, but it's far from being the most difficult trading scenario. There are many things to unpack in this chart, so without further ado, let's begin the analysis right away. As usual, I marked what I consider the major extremes of the market with numbers to facilitate the visualization of the deeper and less obvious details we are going to be looking. The first interesting thing in this chart happens between numbers 1 and 2. It should be clear to you the difference between the strength of both major and minor flows in a situation like this. Numbers 1 and 2 clearly point to extremes in the major dimension. I marked out zigzagging lines in blue to point out the minor flow happening constrained between numbers 1 and 2. This is an almost textbook perfect and real-life example of the minor flow happening inside the major flow. The other important detail about this market vector between numbers 1 and 2 is the fact that price clearly and undeniably surpassed the high number 0. This is a green light for us to call the low number 1 a major and confirmed market structure. The reason for that is logically consistent. When price breaks the high number 0, the information that we can infer is that buyers are strong enough to create higher highs, and the last absolute origin of the most recent and most relevant movement is the low number 1. This is why we can call it a confirmed market structure, and this is also why we can use such levels to place stop-loss orders. They act as a protection. In the market vector between numbers 2 and 3, the market goes back down after the buyers from number 1 exhausted themselves. This is another important thing to understand. Buyers and sellers alternate at all times regardless of the trend bias we have because while one is exhausting its energy, the other is recuperating it. That's why we can have significant counter-trend movements. Observe that in number 3, price comes down near number 1 roughly speaking, and it does that creating a candle with a significant lower tail. That means the buyers that were previously near the low number 1 stepped up a little bit, and they are now willing to bring the market up in a higher low. Once again, this is almost a textbook perfect representation of uptrend. Notice that after number 3, the market goes sideways for a few candles. When the market goes sideways like that, we can safely say that both buyers and sellers are in a state of relative equilibrium. Buyers are not so sure if sellers are completely exhausted yet, and sellers are probably assuming the same about buyers. The most obvious clue we can derive from this portion of price is the conjunction of weird lower tails that happened after candle number 3. Another interesting thing about a sideways market is that it usually happens when the energy of one of the market players is exhausted too quickly, which is exactly what happened in candle number 3. Instead of coming down in a relatively calm manner, price dropped rather violently, and that disrupts the natural flow of how price behaves. This rupture must be corrected somehow. That's why we see that sideways movement after number 3 as a compensation. In number 3.1 we begin to see the first signs of a real market manipulation. So far we have been only describing the market in what appeared to be its natural flowing state without the intervention of large traders or anything like that. Candle number 3.1 marks the precise moment where buyers took control of the market again and decided to raise it dramatically, but there is an important detail here. As it is usual in moments that precede price manipulations, we can see price rising in an orderly fashion. Here we have to be clear about what we mean by that. Price usually behaves in an apparently chaotic motion, and individual candlestick highs and lows seem to be disconnected most of the time. If we look inside the red box in number 3.1, we are going to see that price rises creating a higher high and a higher low with each closed candle. The reason that happens is that large traders intervene at the open of every candle to ensure a continuous flow to their desired direction. As we already saw in other examples, a solid movement like that grabs the attention of many retail traders in the market. We can say that this is the first moment in which the von Restorff effect takes place. Let's be more precise about what that means in this moment and what that might mean in the immediate future. When retail traders see a movement like that, they begin to assume that buyers are really strong, and that a long position is an almost certain way of making some money in this market. This assumption is not exactly wrong, but it is incomplete. What retail traders fail to understand is that the forces producing this exaggerated movement to the upside are not necessarily an irrational combination of many traders going in the same direction. It's probably a result of market intervention, which is something that should make retail traders more skeptical instead of more certain about where price might be going. However, there is a sinister element to this first leg up in the market because its function is not to manipulate traders right away. Its purpose is to add a little more complexity to the second time where the von Restorff effect will appear later in the chart. If you pay close attention, you will see that in the leg between 3.1 and 4 we have the von Restorff effect and the bandwagon effect, but the reverse psychology element is missing because the market is not breaking any levels that could produce some sort of confusion. In other words, this first leg is not a manipulation. It's just an intervention that goes in the direction of the main trend, and it will serve to confuse traders in a different way in the near future. After candle number 4, price starts to fall down just like a rocket that has lost its upward momentum. Notice how it shoots up after 3.1 and it starts to fall down really hard after number 4. Now we are talking about the moments where the real manipulation really begins. Just like the orderly behavior marked inside the red box, the movement after number 4 shows the same quality. Once again, this grabs the attention of retail traders. However, there is an important catch here. Because of the illusion of certainty created by the movement after 3.1, retail traders are now confused when the market starts to come down hard like that. After all, it can be difficult to tell which of the market players is indeed the strongest if they have the same apparent strength, roughly speaking. The fact is that the market is filled with people that see the market vector after 4 with a static bias. Assuming that we have large traders producing the movement down after candle 4, they are probably intending to trigger the breakout traders that are looking to sell this market in the level that I marked as the last solid structure, which is the absolute low that represents the point of ignition of the main buyers of this market. The orderly behavior after number 3.1 should serve as a point of clarification for those who understand the market maker mentality. The reason for that is not so obvious, but it makes sense under the light of what we are seeing here. If the large traders after number 4 are looking to trigger the breakout traders who want to go short, the natural conclusion is that these large traders want to go long. This perfectly matches what happened after number 3.1, which was just an intervention and not a full-blown market manipulation. In other words, the large traders of this market seem to have a predominantly upward bias, so it becomes almost comical when you are capable of understanding that and you see a ridiculously volatile movement like the one after candle 4. It's almost too obvious that these large traders are going to hurt somebody in the market. Once again, this is powerful knowledge, and this is also the time to step back and observe the market. In number 5 we can see price breaking the last solid structure line, and therefore triggering a huge amount of retail breakout traders who thought that was a good level to go short. The market vector between 4 and 5 is clearly the von Restorff effect portion of this manipulation. Pay close attention to the shape of candlestick number 5. It pierces the line where retail traders placed their sell-stop orders and it ended up closing above it. This is the reverse psychology portion of the manipulation taking place, meaning that large traders successfully induced retail traders to the downside, but with the goal of actually driving the market to the upside. This is probably the trickiest part of any manipulation. There are two key elements to understand the reverse psychology that goes on in these subtle market maneuvers. The first is that large traders need retail traders to create deep liquidity pools. The second is that to create these deep liquidity pools, first the large traders must induce retail traders to one side, but they actually want the market to go in the opposite direction. This contrary movement is a practical necessity for the creation of the deep liquidity pools by hitting the cluster of orders placed by retail breakout traders. As we already saw in previous lectures, the bandwagon effect is the missing piece that finishes the manipulation. When candle number 5 does not meet the expectations of breakout retail traders, they become confused and usually pretty desperate because they use very tight and arbitrary stop-loss orders. A sideways market in a situation like this is exactly what these traders don't want, and that's exactly what they experience. The smart trader should be still observing the market at this point and looking for hints that might create a trade opportunity. One of these hints is where the candle 5 tail landed, which is the line marked as the second last solid structure, which points not to the absolute structure point, but to the rough point of ignition of the last confirmed market structure in number 1. The idea for a trade comes in number 6 when we have a candle with a large lowered tail touch this line once again. Under the light of the market maker strategy, this is an opportunity for a few different reasons. We are in the moments that precede the bandwagon effect of this manipulation, meaning that if we are correct in our reading of the large trader dynamics, price is about to go up by the massive order dumping of the large traders and also by the desperate retail traders looking to recuperate their most recent losses. The other element to this trade is that we can use low number 5 as an axis in conjunction with the structure number 1. The expressive lower tails of these candles are also very important because they subjectively tell us there is buyer pressure in the market. The trade you see opened in the chart was triggered right after candle 6 closed. The stop was placed below lows number 5 and 6, and the target is naturally 3 times as large as the stop to give us a nice 1-to-3 risk-reward ratio in this trade. One interesting thing about candle 6 is that under the light of the fractal flow strategy, which is another way of looking at the market, we would be able to characterize it as a fractal candle, and we would have a more objective way of telling that this is indeed a sign to trigger a trade. Let's see how the market behaves next. As you can see here, the target was successfully hit, showing that our reading of the large traders' dynamic was indeed correct. In this lecture we are going to be looking at a trade example in the Australian dollar 4-hour timeframe. This is a rather different example because it involves a situation in which a news event took place in the chart. This is something that usually confuses most traders, especially the ones who are not aware of how market manipulations occur in real life. I usually say that news events only add fuel to the fire of price action in a way. That means that we can usually arrive at useful conclusions just by looking at price action under a technical light instead of worrying about what news events mean. In fact, market manipulations and news events often mix themselves together, and in this example, you will see a pretty clear example of how that can happen in the chart. You will also notice how you don't even need to know what type of news occurred to have a good idea of what the market is going to do. This might seem overly optimistic and even naive, but there is a simple reason it is true. The market is not ruled by large traders nor news events. It's ruled by masses of people reacting to those events, and the way people react to these things is pretty much always the same. In other words, if we understand the market logic sustained by human emotion, one can argue that we can bypass the study of fundamental analysis completely. The market manipulation that we are going to be looking at in this lecture is somewhat different from the other manipulations we already seen because it reduces itself to a single focal point. In other words, it's much quicker and more violent than the other examples. The whole market manipulation revolves around one single candle with an unexpected formation. This has some advantages and some disadvantages, as you will see. As you can observe in the chart, price was making higher highs and higher lows in what appears to be the major fractal. As it is naturally expected, there are always stop orders in the obvious market extremes like the last highs or lows. These orders are placed by the common breakout retail traders, which base themselves in this rather primitive and intuitive way of trading. As we already know, this poses a huge opportunity for large traders. The interesting thing about this example is that the news event that took place served as an unexpected twist to the way the market manipulation began. Once again, the market was creating higher highs and higher lows from number 0 to number 3. The most obvious conclusion anyone can derive from that is that price is going to continue rising. Breakout retail traders, however, make a more dangerous assumption. They simply assume that the last previous high is a good place to go long. We already went over the rationale for this type of thinking in other examples, and we concluded that the problem with this lies in the trade location aspect of trading in such a way. For example, imagine that retail breakout traders intended to go long when price broke high number 1 to the upside. The direction they chose was correct, but look at the trade location. In other words, look at how far away they would be from low number 2, which was the actual reversal point of the market. This is how you can be correct about the direction of the market, but you can be absolutely mistaken about where you are opening trades. The natural conclusion here is that it's not enough to be correct about the direction of the market. You need to be correct about trade location and timing as well. As I already mentioned a few times here, the odd thing about this example is that the tridimensional axis of the manipulation happens too quickly, and this can be a challenge in real time if you are not careful. Let's take a deep look at what happened in candlestick number 5. Right around number 4, the retail breakout traders are preparing themselves to go long if the market surpasses the high number 3. In candle 5 we can see that price breaks high number 3, triggering a large amount of buy stop orders, and therefore, creating a deep liquidity pool that enables large traders to take the opposite position in the market, which in this case is the short side. You should be able to observe that this manipulation occurred simultaneously with news events, which serve the purpose to add fuel to the fire, but they don't change the rough dynamics of price. The three axes of our manipulation occur in candle 5. If you imagine the visual effect of candle 5 when it was trading near its high, you can imagine how this would represent the von Restorff effect and the reverse psychology portion of this market maneuver. When candle 5 was trading near its high, its apparent volatility was much higher than most candles in the chart, so that would give retail breakout traders a good amount of certainty. When candle 5 closed, most retail traders were already stopped out, and they started to realize that maybe they were wrong about the overall direction of the market. This is the reverse psychology maneuver being successfully employed. Immediately after the reverse psychology is realized, the bandwagon effect begins to take place, and the market starts to doubt the uptrend that began in number 0 as far as we can see. The difficult thing about this trade was the moment to open a sell position, because to derive that conclusion, you would have to be certain about the tridimensional axis of the manipulation you see on the chart. That would be the closest you would get to an objective tool to trigger the trade. This is why the market maker strategy can be difficult sometimes. You have to be confident about your ability to enter a trade based on your subjective interpretation of this tridimensional axis. The short position you see was opened right after candle number 5 precisely for the fact that the termination of candle 5 seemed to be the beginning of the bandwagon effect, which is the third and final axis of the manipulation. Since we have been going in an uptrend, and large traders apparently took the reverse position of long and retail breakout traders, it makes sense to open a short position with a stop above the high of candle 5. The rationale for that stop loss is that, if we are on the side of large traders for the downside, it is very unlikely that they are going to let the market go above the high of candle 5. For the target we must respect the idea of expectancy and optimal risk-reward ratios, so our target should have between 1 to 3 and 1 to 4 risk-reward ratios. It's even better if this calculation coincides with a major point in price like we see here. Our target is 3.5 times larger than our stop, roughly speaking, and it coincides with low number 0, which seems to be a major point in the chart. Let's see how this market turns out. As you can clearly see here, the manipulation in number 5 acted as a tipping point for the market to reverse and trigger our target successfully. In this lecture we are going to study a market manipulation example that involves the use of a wash line to trigger a trade opportunity. This example also includes the mixture of an economic news announcement with a pure market manipulation. As it was pointed out in previous lectures, these two elements can certainly go together simply because news announcement increase the volatility, and that can be very useful for market makers. The starting point of our analysis of a market manipulation in alignment with news announcements is that market logic remains intact despite the sudden shifts in volatility. In other words, the basic mechanics of price are still the same regardless of what news announcements come out. Another way of looking at this is that these announcements only add fuel to the fire of price action, but they don't change how the fire burns. One thing that confuses many traders is the fact that these movements happen too quickly, and this is something that creates the illusion that news announcements break the natural order of price, but according to the school of thought that we adhere to, this is not the case at all. The reason this is not the case is that no matter how dramatic an announcement is, it still needs to respect the supply and demand mechanism of the markets. This underlying mechanism is the absolute basis for the creation of a market in the first place, and it cannot be broken in any way. If we consider that, we will be able to see that news announcements and market manipulations still must function within a predictable framework. That's good news for all traders who understand the psychology involved in manipulations, because we can have a firmer ground to predict how price is going to behave around these events. It's important to clear these things up a little bit because some traders think that news announcements are some sort of market miracle or a temporary suspension of normal market logic. If that was the case, we would have absolutely no ground to analyze the charts around these areas. The most primordial assumption here is that market logic cannot be simply suspended randomly. It must be a hard and unbreakable concept. In this chart we have a very good example of this. From number 1 to 3 we have the classic major flow formation of a downtrend. In other words, lower lows and lower highs. From numbers 4 to number 7 we have what appears to be the minor flow of this market, which is also going down momentarily. The key to placing these market vectors correctly within their hierarchy is to compare their size and volatility. Take a look at the difference between vectors from 1 to 3 and the vectors from 4 to 7. We can safely say that vector from 1 to 3 is twice as big, so in relative terms, we have well-established major and minor flows. The problem is that when you look at the minor flow between 4 and 7 alone, you can have the impression that it is a major flow. It's a matter of frame of reference in this case. This is probably the most confusing thing about this chart. Right after number 7 we have a massive upward candle that wipes out highs number 6, number 4, and number 2. In other words, a candle that takes out minor and major highs of the market. In the light of the tridimensional axis of market manipulation we have been talking about in the theoretical and practical lectures of this course so far, this massive candle is clearly the von Restorff effect in action. When this candle appears on the screen, you cannot take your eyes out of it simply because it stands out too much. The fact that it moves quickly does not help either. However, if we take a cold look at what happened here, we will see that many retail breakout traders got their long positions triggered, especially in major high number 2. When price was up there near high number 8, these retail traders were thinking they got the market figured out. The second part of the manipulation is when market makers start to hammer the high of candle 8 to make it close below the high number 2. This is a poking movement that creates desperation in those long retail breakout traders. At the closing of candle 8, many retail traders are already stopped out and looking for revenge. In other words, the reverse psychology worked like a charm by triggering traders to the upside only to create the revenge for the downside. This is also the beginning of the bandwagon effect because many retail traders are looking to recuperate their losses, and therefore, they are looking to go short now. The important detail here is that large traders already got in their short positions when they started pounding the high number 8 down. They did this by taking advantage of the cluster of orders from retail traders at high number 2. When high 8 pokes high number 2, a deep liquidity pool for the downside is opened, and large traders immediately get in. This is why they need retail traders to enter massive positions in the market. From this paradigm we can characterize high number 2 as the level wherein retail traders got washed out of their positions. The horizontal line you see labeled wash line is precisely that. The precise level wherein retail traders got hurt. This same level can be used as a sneaky way of entering the market after the most violent parts of the manipulative maneuvers are complete. The short position you see opened in the chart was opened with a sell limit order in the wash line. After candle 8 closed, price opened below the line and a sell limit order was placed at the wash line with a stop above high number 8. Observe that the candle marked by the green arrow tests the wash line and price starts to go down. The target is naturally at least 3 times as big as the stop loss for us to have an expectancy value higher than 1. Let's see how the market reacts. As you can see here, a nice downtrend started after the manipulation in number 8, and our short position proven to be correct. In this lecture we are going to analyze a short trade in the Canadian dollar 5-minute timeframe. This is a relatively simple trade with the use of the wash line, and rather simple notions about pure price action reading like the inside candle. Without further ado, let's jump right into the analysis to see how all the elements of the manipulation took place in this particular example. Notice also how manipulations occur pretty much in the same way in all timeframes. From number 1 to number 5, we can see price making higher highs and higher lows in what appears to be the major flow. Here we have to make a quick pause to give this part of the analysis its due respect. You probably already observed that I always start any analysis, regardless of the method being used, with the simple counting of major and minor highs and lows. This should be the starting point of any good market analysis. The numbers I marked on the chart represent the market extremes that fall into the major flow category under my own subjective judgment. That means that not all traders will completely agree with the numbers you see in the chart. For example, if we take a look at the market vector between 5 and 6, you will notice that there is a high and a low in the middle that could very well fit the major flow category. However, that would only be the case if that high and low were to be analyzed individually. If you place them in context with the surrounding volatility and the previous highs and lows since number 1, we can assume this node in price can be categorized under the minor flow. The main reason for that is the increase in volatility after high number 5. If volatility increases, then both major and minor flows will naturally increase as well. As I said previously, not all traders will agree with this analysis because this sort of thing is completely subjective, which does not mean it is wrong. Every type of analysis will lead to right and wrong answers eventually, so don't worry too much about that. With that said, let's go back to the beginning of the analysis. Observe that high number 3 surpassed the high number 1, and this rendered the low number 2 as a solid market structure. Let's take a moment to dig under that statement to see what it truly means. When a high surpasses another high, it means that buyers were strong enough to produce that effect, and it is useful to track the origin of that movement, so we can use it later as some sort of axis to our analysis. The origin of the buyers who produced high number 3 is logically around the area of low number 2. This seems to be a perfectly reasonable assumption. That's an objective way of seeing price extremes, but there is also a subjective way of doing that, and if you align both, you can arrive at a more precise idea of where exactly the buyers picked up the market. Observe that I drew a red rectangle, and its origin is at the lower tails of 2 candles that happened right after low number 2. According to my own subjective interpretation, this is the exact moment where buyers picked the market up. It turns out that subjective interpretations also have to be logically justified. They are not some sort of mysterious and intuitive perception about the market because that would be completely useless. Observe that I marked 2 upward green arrows near low number 2. That marks 2 candles with unusually long lower tails. This is an indication of buying pressure around that area, and it can be considered the moment wherein buyers took control to produce high number 3. We can verify that was the case by seeing what happened in number 4 when price comes back precisely to the area inside the red rectangle, and then reverses again to produce another vector upwards. All of this means that we are dealing with an upward trend, but as you can clearly notice by the length of my commentary, it's not so simple as counting highs and lows. There are all sorts of subjective conclusions one can make about the validity of such highs and lows in the chart. From number 1 to number 4, the market interpretation is fairly straightforward, but precisely at high number 5, an interesting phenomenon displays itself. The last significant high made by buyers was high number 3, so if buyers are going to prove themselves once again, they should in principle surpass that level with some degree of certainty. However, that's not what happens in high number 5. Notice that in high number 5, price pierces the high number 3 level, as you can see by the black horizontal line, and it closes below that level. This is where the retail breakout traders got their buy orders triggered, because all of them were waiting to go long when price surpassed that level. This notion was clearly amplified by the previous candle to number 5. Notice that it is a high volatility candle that serves as the von Restorff effect. This is the first leg of the market manipulation being successfully employed. Right after number 5, price begins to fall down, and both lows number 4 and number 2 are broken. What causes this is the reverse psychology and bandwagon effect being applied in the retail traders. Once price starts to fall down after number 5, retail traders start to get their stop orders triggered, so they immediately start to look for ways to recuperate that. The way they do this is by going short, which ends up helping the large traders' position to increase since they got short when the retail traders got long in the wash line. Once again, the mechanics of the manipulation is exactly the same. People get excited to trade in one direction, then they get disappointed, and then they tend to plan their revenge, which is something that only helps the market makers in the end. The wash line you can see in the chart represents the level in which retail traders were misled by the large traders, hence the rather cynical name of the line. In other words, that was the level where the retail traders were washed out of their positions. The aftermath of the manipulation is that this wash line can still be used in the future because it is a significant market level that the market tends to respect, especially when large traders still influence it to some degree. The market vector between numbers 5 and 6 is the absolute and undeniable proof that buyers are no longer dominant in this market. The advantage is that now we have a wash line and a solid market structure in high number 5 to count on if we want to short this market around that area. However, this notion alone is usually not enough. We have to wait for other cues to place a trade as a matter of caution. The final cues we have for the short position you see on the chart happen between numbers 6 and 7, and precisely at number 7 as well. Observe that from point 6 onwards, price begins to rise in a suspiciously organized manner for a chaotic system. This means large traders are still playing games in this market, and they are certainly going to respect the level they created themselves, which is the wash line. The final cue is candle number 7, which is an inside candle that happened right after price met the wash line. For all intents and purposes, an inside candle means a temporary stop, which can mean it is time to get in the market. If we ally that to the notion that large traders are still influencing the market, and the fact that all of this is happening very near our wash line, we have a trade opportunity in our hands. The short trade you see here was triggered at the open of the candle right next to candle number 7 with a stop above high number 5, and a target at the low number 6. The stop is based on the assumption that if we are correct, the large traders will bring the market down from the wash line, and that little spike in high number 5 gives us a small safety range. The target is based on the assumption that if sellers were able to produce low number 6, they will be able to produce that range again. Let's see how the market develops. As you can see here, our reading of the market manipulation was correct, and our target ended up being hit successfully. In this lecture we are going to analyze a Euro-Pound 1-hour chart with an example that uses an especially limited amount of price information, which serves the purpose of showing you how you don't need to look at what happened in the distant past to see what's going on in the market. What I mean by distant past is of course relative to the timeframe we use to trade. As a rule of thumb, you should be able to see the candle's nuances. If you are going back more than 150 or 200 candles, you are probably going back too far in your chart. This example is a little special because we are just looking at about 50 candles back. We are going to be looking at yet another manipulation maneuver that functions within our well-established tridimensional axis. By now you must be getting used to the idea that pretty much all market manipulations work under this paradigm. If you look at the price action before number 1, you will be able to see a normal flowing market that is not subjected to any sort of manipulation. It's obviously an upward market up to number 1, and that gap reinforces that notion. Once again, we can see this as an uptrend by looking at the major flow marked by short and thick black horizontal lines. From point number 1 onwards, things start to change a lot in this market. If you are the sort of trader that is not aware of how large traders play in the market, you would have a really hard time understanding what's going on from point 1 onwards. This would inevitably result in confusion that would later result in a lack of confidence to trade. Traders tend to fear what they don't understand, so the key to eliminating fear is studying the subtle mechanics involved in the market. Let's go through the mindset of a breakout trader in this market for a moment. If you find yourself around number 1, your last long trade near the bottom left corner of the chart probably worked out well, so now you are confident you can make the same thing again when price breaks the high number 1. That gap also adds a little more hope to your idea of getting long at the break of high number 1. When you see the wide bullish candle right after low number 2, you are almost certain that this market will shoot up like a rocket, and that you would be foolish to waste this opportunity. This exact moment is what we call the von Restorff effect in the methodology that you are learning in the course. In other words, large traders purposefully bring attention to a single point in the chart to make retail breakout traders extremely confident and hopeful. Let's also notice that since there are many retail breakout traders in the market thinking along the same lines, there is a dense cluster of buy orders sitting at the level of high number 1. You are probably already aware that large traders will pierce that level to trigger that cluster of orders, and that will create a deep liquidity pool. Let's also examine exactly what that means, and the mechanics that surround this idea. When a dense cluster of orders is triggered, it means that there is a huge opportunity for other market players to take the opposite position. In this specific situation, when many buy orders are triggered, a huge selling opportunity appears simply because there are too many people buying. That's simple supply and demand mechanics. The thing is that large traders can often overpower masses of retail traders, and that's what candle number 3 is all about. Candle 3 is the triggering of a cluster of orders to generate an opportunity for large traders to get in the market in the opposite direction. Notice that large traders overpowered retail traders and made that candle close below the high number 1 level, and also close near the absolute low of the candle 3 itself. This candle sends a clear message to the retail breakout traders, and that message is that they were mistaken about the market. This is exactly where the reverse psychology process begins to take place, because many of those retail traders are already stopped out since they place stop-loss orders that are too tight. The ones that are not yet stopped out begin to close their orders manually out of desperation. Don't forget that while all of this is happening, large traders are in control of a massive sell position, and what happens next just helps this large position to get even bigger. After number 3, when people see price starting to fall, they start to jump into the bandwagon to the downside, so to speak, and that's the tridimensional axis working in full circle. That explains the method of maneuvering retail traders, but it does not explain how an observer of the markets would actually take advantage of this situation. This is where clever line work in the charts can make the difference. You will often see price coming back to the wash line, and that's an excellent opportunity for us because we can take advantage of that to trade with a good risk-reward ratio around these manipulations. Beyond that, other types of line work in the chart that point to the same area can also be extremely useful to trigger trades, but that's something that requires some experience with precise line drawing. Observe that in number 4, price made a lower low than number 2, and this makes high number 3 a solid market structure. Notice how high number 3 is probably the most important point in this chart, since it is a solid structure and also the main axis of the manipulation maneuver. All of this means that if price comes back near the wash line, price will be exactly in a sell zone, which is something that would represent a perfect selling opportunity in this context. In this lecture I want to show you an advanced way of getting into a trade like this using the clever use of lines. Observe that I drew a green line starting from number 2 and extended it to number 4 to catch the angle of the new market axis. One logical technique to pinpoint an opposite market edge is to use the same angle in the previous and opposite market extreme. In other words, by using the angle discovered in the lows number 2 and 4 and extending it in high number 3, we can sometimes foresee the next market edge. This only works in specific situations when you have other elements pointing to the same area, which is exactly the case here since we have a wash line pointing to the same market level, roughly speaking. The way to trade these lines is obvious. Since we are dealing with a sell trade opportunity, which agrees with the large trader's position in this market, we can place a sell limit order at the wash line, or we can place a sell limit order at the upper green line. In this case I placed the sell limit order at the upper green line and I got filled almost exactly at what appears to be a reversal point in the market. The stop loss was placed above the upper tail of candle 3 because it is the main axis of the whole market manipulation in place. The target was placed at the upper limit of what I called the subjective buyer's point of ignition in the lower portion of the chart where I drew the red rectangle. Observe the origin of that rectangle and you will notice unusual lower tails indicating buying pressure just before price took off in a massive bullish candle marked by the vertical line. That's an unusual trade with a risk-reward ratio of almost 1 to 10, but we have good logical reasons to believe this will turn out to be a successful trade. It's not merely an arbitrary choice. Let's take a look at how this market played out. Here we can see that price reached our target, rendering our trade as a victory. Notice also how the red rectangle is now creating a bump in price after a significant drop, just to confirm the notion of the subjective buyer's point of ignition. In this lecture we are going to study an advanced trade situation that happened in the Euro-Yen 30-minute chart. This is a more advanced trade because it involves more subtle ideas like the sloped wash line and frequency lines as well. These are relatively simple things to grasp, but their application is not always obvious, otherwise they would be part of folk wisdom by now, and they are certainly not. The first thing you should notice here is that I have less than 100 candles on this chart, which is once again the proof that you don't need to go thousands of candles back to really understand what's going on. I like to say that price has a relatively short memory, which is obviously relative to the timeframe you are trading, but price does not seem to care too much about events that are way deep into the past, which is certainly a relief. This is a curious example because you will notice there is a market manipulation, but the whole maneuver happens within what we can call a normal flowing market. From number 0 to number 2, we have price making a lower low, which for all intents and purposes means downtrend. I suppose it would be really difficult to find someone that would disagree with that proposition in this situation. In point 2 we know that sellers have proven their ground. As you might be expecting already, this is not the interesting part of the analysis because it's too easy to notice that. Things begin to twist between numbers 4 and 5. Observe that after low number 2, price begins to naturally rise. I say naturally because regardless of the type of trend we have, the buyers and sellers are always alternating between energy accumulation and energy exhaustion. Number 2 is where the sellers were completely exhausted. That would explain why buyers started to pick the market up from that point, and also those longer lower tails around number 2. Those tails certainly imply buying pressure at that level, and this is something that will be useful later in the analysis. From number 2 to number 3 we can see price rising naturally as well, but since we are still in a downtrend, number 3 is far from breaking high number 1. Observe that around high number 3 we have the opposite situation that we had in low number 2. Buyers are now exhausting their accumulated energy, and sellers are beginning to take control of the market again. We can verify that subjectively by looking at the upper tails of the candles around high number 3. Those upper tails are implying selling pressure in that level. Let's take a moment to really understand why those tails imply that. A candle like that with an unusually large upper tail means that price was once high up, but sellers were strong enough to beat it down. Observe how that happened consecutively in 4 candles. After that, price begins to fall. If this is going to continue being a downtrend, price will have no problem breaking the low number 2 to continue its natural flow downwards. However, since things can never be that simple in the market, notice that this is not what happened in number 4. In number 4 we can see price action failing to break the low number 2, and this is something that sends a specific message to a certain type of trader, but remember that until high number 1 is violated, we still have a downtrend. I want you to pay attention to where exactly price lands and reverses in low number 4. As you can see, I drew a red horizontal line called frequency line that marks this level in a very specific way. A frequency line is a line that catches the common ground between several candlestick tails. This can happen horizontally or in an angled manner. This particular frequency line has its origins in low number 2. Observe carefully how the line ties all of those candles' lower tails, meaning that it cuts through all the candles' tails in a way that pinpoints their underlying frequency, hence the name of the line. That was a line that could be drawn right after low number 2 and way before number 3 and 4 were formed. Observe now the relationship between price and the frequency line in low number 4. Notice how price lands in that line, pierces it a few times and never closes below it. All that means is that the buyers that took control in number 2 are still present in that level in number 4, but the frequency line gives you a precise way of seeing it. As I said previously, the fact that price didn't break the low number 2 sends a message to the retail breakout traders, who are now certain that going long at the break of high number 3 is a good idea. We cannot run the risk of making such assumptions. That's why we first wait for price to reach that level, and then we can arrive at some conclusions. Needless to say, but at this point large traders are well aware of the retail trader's plan. We can see the first fingerprints of market makers in candle number 4.1, which is a volatile bullish candle heading directly to the high number 3. When retail traders see that candle they can't help themselves. Their level of certainty seems to get higher and higher. We are talking about the first leg of the manipulation at this point, which is the von Restorff effect. In this example the von Restorff effect is present, but it's not too explicit. Candle number 5 is where the fun really begins. Pay close attention to candle number 5 and what it represents for both market makers and retail traders. Large traders already knew there was a big order cluster at high number 3, so the conclusion that naturally follows is that by poking that cluster, an immense liquidity pool will open, and a market maneuver opportunity will present itself. That's exactly what happened in candle 5. When price was above the high number 3, many buy orders were triggered, and that means there was a huge opportunity to take the opposite side of that deal. The only group of market players that could realistically do that in an orchestrated manner are the large traders that we talk about in these lectures. The creation of the liquidity pool is a green light for them to get in the market with an astonishingly large sell position in this case. Notice the size of candle 5's upper tail. If you consider what we already discussed about what these tails imply, you will have no problem seeing there was massive selling pressure in that upper tail. When candle 5 closes, retail traders are either already stopped out or in a pure state of desperation. This is where the reverse psychology and bandwagon effect start to take place. It's a reverse psychology because they were triggered to the upside with one goal and one goal only, which was to actually trigger them to the downside later. The bandwagon effect bit of the manipulation happens because retail traders usually have little control over their emotions, and they want to recuperate their losses as soon as possible. The logical thing to do in their minds is to simply reverse their position as soon as they can. Ironically, this is what consolidates the market maker's position and makes it plummet to number 6. This means two things for us in this course. We now have a lower low than 4 and 2, which means that number 5 is a solid market structure on which we can rely. The second thing is that we have a manipulation level that will probably be respected in the future, so we can use it as a contextual element for a trade. There are a few more details I want you to pay close attention to. One of them is what happened with the upper tails of the candles surrounding high number 5. Notice that their frequency forms a short down-sloping line that I marked in red. This line has upper and lower limits, and the space in between forms what I like to call a press zone. Let's unpack the meaning of a press zone so you can understand what it means. Those descending upper tails around number 5 are the consecutive attempts of large traders to pound the market to the downside. In other words, they are pressing the market down. The funny thing is that this sort of thing usually passes unnoticed by 99.9% of the market, and yet it seems ridiculously obvious when you realize it. The press zone can serve the same purpose of a supply and demand zone in naturally swinging markets. Beyond that we also have two special lines drawn after the manipulation took place, which is the horizontal wash line and the sloped wash line. The horizontal wash line, like we already saw in previous examples in the course, is fairly straightforward. It just marks the level in which retail traders were washed out of their positions and extends it to the future. The sloped wash line is a bit more complicated. The sloped wash line in this case is a combination of the horizontal wash line principle with the idea behind frequency lines. In other words, to draw a sloped wash line, we have to use the highs that were used as axes in the manipulation, and we have to catch the frequency of their upper tails. The origin of that sloped wash line is logically in high number 3. Notice how the line catches all of the upper tails. The second axis of the line is what is going to determine its angle. The second axis used here is of course the high number 5 where most of the manipulation occurred. We want to catch the frequency of those upper tails in high number 5 in a way that the angle does not take the line in high number 3 out of frequency with its corresponding tails. We also want to make sure that price does not close above the line at any point. We are only concerned with the frequency of the tails. If you follow all those steps correctly, the line you get is the one you see drawn in the chart. What happens between numbers 7 and 10 are the key to the short position you see in the chart. In number 7 we see price touching both the lower limit of our press zone and the sloped wash line almost perfectly. That's a good indication, but we usually wait for a bit more than that. In candle 8 we see an inside candle showing that price is making a temporary stop, which is something that agrees with the idea of short trade. In candle 9 price touches the sloped wash line and the lower limit of the press zone once again. We could have placed a sell limit order at the sloped wash line. That would be the most advanced way of getting into this market in a situation like this. However, there are easier ways to do that, and one of them would be to wait candle 10 close. Observe that we have a clear pattern here. We have two extremely precise touches in two very important lines followed by an inside candle each time that happened. The short position you see in the chart was opened at the opening of the candle next to candle 10. The stop was placed logically above high number 5, and the target is naturally 3 times as big as the stop to give us a nice risk-reward ratio. Let's take a look at how this market played out. Here you can see the analysis was correct and price went down far enough to trigger the take profit order in our short position. In this lecture we are going to be looking at an advanced example of a double market manipulation in the Australian dollar versus the Japanese yen 15-minute timeframe. What happens in this particular example is not what you will find most of the time in the market, but it is certainly useful to study these more complicated scenarios, so we can have a better grasp of how far these manipulations can really go. I will throw some exotic line studies as well, so you can see the underlying symmetry of the market. As usual, we begin the analysis by picking a relatively comfortable amount of price information in the chart, which is something between 100 and 200 candles I would say. There are two reasons for that. The first reason is that we need to be able to see the details of price well enough, and the second reason is that price action has a short memory, so it doesn't seem to care about what happened too far in the relative past of the timeframe you will be trading. The very next step is to count the most important highs and lows in the chart because they are the axes that will form our analysis, so to speak. Between numbers 1 and 5 there is not much going on in this market other than the undeniable fact that sellers are producing lower highs and lower lows. This is what we call the natural flow of price action. There is no manipulation nor any type of market intervention whatsoever. There is just the natural swinging motion of price action. This market starts to twist around number 6 onwards. Observe that high number 4 is the last solid market structure up to that point, and high number 6 lightly pokes it. In a situation like this, a light poke cannot be considered a large trader's attempt to create a deep liquidity pool. When we have a small poke like that, we tend to ignore it because we have something called market noise. You will see what a real stop hunting candle tail looks like in just a moment. After candle 6, price starts to fall, and our downtrend hasn't yet been taken down. All the solid sellers' structures are intact. This seems to be good news for you if you are a retail trader because you have a very clear goal for what your next trade will be at this point, which is the low number 5. Since price is going down, retail traders will attempt to place a sell stop order at low number 5 thinking that the natural momentum of price will drive their positions to profitable territory. As price approaches the low number 5, observe that it starts to accelerate. As you might be getting used to at this point, this is done on purpose by the large traders, and we can see that's the case by observing how this acceleration occurs in an organized manner, meaning that each candle that passes by creates a lower high and a lower low as it is marked by the series of red arrows. This is the von Restorff effect in the first manipulation in this chart. In candle number 7, the large traders pierce low number 5 with a significant degree of violence to trigger the cluster of sell orders, and therefore, create a deep liquidity pool for the exact opposite side. In other words, as soon as the deep liquidity pool is created, large traders enter massive long positions. This is usually the way the large traders sneak in these massive positions in the market without grabbing too much attention. The lower tail of candle 7 is a signature of that. If you wanted to take advantage of this manipulation at this time, you could use the horizontal line that comes out of number 5 as a wash line. Observe that in candle number 8, price comes back to the wash line for a brief moment, and then it shoots up. For you to take advantage of that in real time you would have to be a really good trader. This type of trade is among one of the most advanced and subtle types you can do in the market, but as you can see, there is logic to it. The other two legs of the first manipulation occur in the lower to mid portion of the candle 8. Once again, the process is exactly the same. Retail traders become desperate because their short positions are being stopped out, and they begin assuming the opposite position to attempt a quick recovery. Let's not forget that by the time this happens, large traders are already in the market, so anyone that enters a long position is actually helping the large traders. That would be the reverse psychology of a market manipulation, meaning that retail traders are purposefully triggered to one side of the market with the sole purpose of being triggered to the opposite side of the market right after. In case if you're wondering why this is necessary, just remember that for large traders to open big positions, they need deep liquidity pools, and they can only do that by whipping other traders. Candle number 8 also shows the bandwagon effect, which also happens to work in favor of the large trader's position. The problem for retail traders at these stages is that they don't hold their positions long enough. They close their trades as soon as they see profit in the terminal. This is a case of hyperbolic discounting, and it's one of the reasons why they keep being whipped around like that time after time. Now it's where the rest of the fun begins in this chart because market makers are preparing themselves to do the exact same process once again. That's why I called this a double manipulation. These two manipulative maneuvers are intertwined because the bandwagon effect of the first one is the von Restorff effect of the second manipulation. The process is exactly the same, but now the retail traders are after high number 6. When they look at candle 8, they think the market will definitely rise if price breaks high number 6. In candle 9, the exact same process that happened in candle 7 occurs again, but this time it's mirrored of course. You might be asking why large traders would do a double manipulation like that, and there is just one possible answer to this, which is to attempt entering an even larger position that was entered in the first manipulation maneuver. Remember that in number 9, large traders are still carrying a large long position. In number 9, they poke the long orders of retail traders to create the opportunity for them to sell, and at the same time, they have themselves a large long position they can dump as well. The end result of this is a short position even larger than the long position that resulted from the first manipulation. You can think about this second manipulation as a way of increasing the size of the first manipulation. The direction of the market is irrelevant since they can control that to a certain degree. The trade you see in this chart is actually a prelude to the next course about pitchforks and Newtonian physics in the market. What I want to do here is to grab your attention to some of the symmetries we can find in price action, and how we can use these symmetries to find trades using the market manipulation we discussed here as the surrounding context. Observe that I have a downward pitchfork drawn in the chart. This fork was drawn using the two central axes of both manipulations, and the immediately previous significant high. The reasons for this divide themselves into self-evident and non-obvious. They are self-evident because we are using obvious extremes with clear importance in the chart, and they are non-obvious because we haven't yet seen why we must draw pitchforks in such a way. That will come in future courses. The main thing you need to understand is that one of the uses of a pitchfork like that is to pinpoint the absolute edges of the market. After number 9, we see price fall down a bit, so it's logical to wait for price to bump up again to give us an opportunity to enter the market in alignment with the large trader's short position. A pitchfork is a dynamic line that can pinpoint with crazy precision the level in which price will reverse. That's exactly the trade you see here in this chart. I entered the short position exactly when price touched the upper line of the pitchfork. Before you open your charts to see how well this idea works, keep in mind that this specific fork in this specific situation only works because we drew it in the correct place and in the correct time. In other words, I drew it in the correct context of the market manipulation. The stop loss was placed above high number 9. The target was placed at low number 7, which gives us a perfect 1-to-3 risk-reward ratio trade. Let's see how the market plays out. As you can see here, our trade idea was successful. Pay attention to how price behaves around the blue fork. The manipulation maneuvers that we identified gave birth to a fork that was able to bring out the underlying symmetry of this market. There is no other way of seeing these lines. We will study these things in great length in the next course. In this lecture we are going to analyze a simple example of a market manipulation in the Canadian dollar 30-minute timeframe. This is a relatively simple example that makes use of the wash line principle. As you can see in the chart, there is only about 80 candlesticks visible, which makes the analysis much easier to accomplish because there are fewer things to worry about. If you keep looking back too far into the past, you can run into problems. In number 1 through 4 we can see that price made a lower high and a lower low. This means downtrend if we respect the formal definition, but we don't go out placing trades just because we saw a couple of highs and lows. We must analyze the market a little deeper for that. After number 4, you could attempt to place a sell trade around high number 3, and you would not be entirely incorrect to think that, after all, we have a solid structure in 3. However, I always say that we have to observe how the market behaves when it reaches a level that we intend to trade. That idea alone would eliminate the possibility of a trade around number 3 because the candle right after low number 4 wipes out highs number 3 and number 1. This is precisely the point where this whole structure becomes important for a future trade idea. When price was around high number 3, retail traders were thinking that it would be a good idea to sell the low number 2. Retail traders are often wrong about this, but they cannot really let that idea go because sometimes it works. The problem is not how often breakout trading works. It's the risk management structure around it that is not sustainable. As you can see in the chart, after that massive candle right next to low number 4, those short retail traders were washed out of their positions. That volatile candle also triggers the reverse psychology and bandwagon effect in the manipulation. The von Restorff effect happened in a different way here. It's not the purposeful attention-grabbing candle before the manipulation. In this case, it's how obvious the low number 2 seems to be a good short trade idea for the retail traders. The low number 2 is the level that was used as an axis by large traders, so this is where we can draw the horizontal wash line. Observe that the retail traders that were looking to go long in high number 3 got the chance of seeing some decent profit in their terminals. Once again, the problem here is that they don't really have a good place to put a stop loss, and the trade location of this method of trading is poor to say the least. They often get in the market in the middle of nowhere, meaning that they enter not near the edges or reversals, but they enter in the middle of market vectors. It's just not a good idea. After number 5 we can see that buyers have exhausted their accumulated energy, and price starts to fall. Take a moment to notice the difference between how price rises from 4 to 5 and how price falls from 5 to 6. It should be obvious to you that buying pressure seems to be a lot higher than selling pressure. This is something that retail traders simply fail to recognize most of the time. They tend to have a colder look at the market that simply glosses over nuances like that. It's not just about the objective measure between highs and lows. It's also about the way price moves between these points. That can make the difference between a successful analysis and a failed one. The problem is that this sort of thing is not comfortable because it's subjective to a certain degree, and nobody likes the mixture of risk and subjectivity. However, subjectivity in the market is a necessary evil. In number 6 we can see that price fell back to the wash line that came out of low number 2, which was the low that was used as the axis in the manipulation. One of the interesting things about a wash line is that it has a built-in stop loss, which in this case would be the low number 4. Beyond that, this is not merely an arbitrary stop loss. It has a logically consistent motive for being considered a good stop loss. Observe also that we have a well-established uptrend in the chart after number 5. The low number 4 is now a solid market structure, and our wash line is giving us an objective level to trade around the point of ignition of that massive bullish candle that took out the highs 1 and 3. In summary, we are apparently in the same side as the market makers. We have a notion of uptrend, we have a place to put a stop loss and a good place to trigger the trade. The trade you see opened in the chart was triggered in the second time price touched the wash line, which is what happened in number 6, which also happens to be a fractal candle if you analyze this market under the light of the fractal flow strategy. In other words, you would have an extra layer of confirmation here if you used both strategies simultaneously. The target was placed around number 5 to give us a risk-reward ratio of 1 to 6. Let's see how the market developed. As you can see here, the wash line in combination with the contextual understanding of what the market makers were doing pinpointed the most precise entry level possible and a very well planned and simple trade. In this lecture we are going to take a look at a long trade example in the Euro 30-minute chart. I would say that this is one of those difficult trades to catch in real time because of the subtlety of the entry process. One thing that must be clear to you is that the entry method depending on the methodology can be considered an art form. That's not caprice. It's because price can always do something different and unexpected at these crucial points. In the chart you see on the screen you can notice that there is a small amount of price information. This does not necessarily mean that the analysis will be easier because highs and lows can get confusing pretty quickly. Observe that between numbers 1 and 4 we have an expanding pivot formation, which is when a higher high is followed by a lower low or vice versa. This is a problem because it creates too many possible outcomes for price. However, the market vector from 5 to 6 clears up the mess and states that the market is indeed going in an upward motion. The object of study of this chart will be centered around the candlestick number 6, which acted as the von Restorff effect portion of the tridimensional axis of manipulative market maneuvers. There are many interesting features about this candlestick, but let's give it some context first so we can analyze it better in a later moment. When price was up there in high number 6, we have a few undeniable facts in the chart. We can safely say that lows 3 and 5 are solid market structures because buyers were successful in proving their point after these specific lows. Look at how price creates a new high after low 3 and after low 5. All this means is that these lows can be used as axes for us to observe what price does in the future. One other detail is the low number 1, which was part of the expanding pivot. Look at how price lands exactly in the low 1, which also happens to be in the area where buyers took control after low 3. The low that was used as a target for the manipulation in this chart is low number 5. We can tell that by the size of the candle falling right into it. When retail traders see that candle 6 falling that way, they are almost certain that low number 5 will be a good place to put a sell order. On the other hand, we already know that this is a trap. Candle 6 is the most obvious representation of a von Restorff effect that you will ever find. It does not get any more obvious than this. Take a look now at where the lower tail of candle 6 landed and how the candle closed. It washed the retail traders from low number 5, but it also landed almost exactly in the line identified as the primary axis of the expanding pivot formation. This line also happens to be in a buy zone around number 3. Observe that we have a regular wash line, a sloped wash line and a line that marks the origin of the expanding pivot. There are many possibilities here. We could open a position at the third touch of the sloped wash line. We could also wait for a second touch of the regular wash line. We could wait for a second touch of the expanding pivot line, or we could open a position in the open of the next candle. There are all of these possibilities here, and it's impossible to know which one of them is going to be the best or if price is going to respect all of them. The position you see on the chart was opened at the third touch of the red sloped wash line simply because it is the line that was tested the largest number of times with success. The stop was placed below low number 3, and the target is simply the multiplication of the stop by 3 to give us a nice risk and reward ratio. Low number 3 seems to be a better choice for a stop due to the volatility of candle 6 and the fact that we have an expanding pivot formation on the chart. Let's see how the market develops. As you can see here, you could have used any of the 3 lines to enter this trade, and you would be successful in all of them. However, keep in mind that this is not always the case. There will be times when the market simply will not reach the line you want, or it will simply do something unpredictable. That's part of trading. Thankfully, we have the mathematical and statistical advantages of good risk-reward ratios to help us overcome these difficult moments. In this lecture we are going to study a simpler example of manipulation that occurred in the dollar versus the Japanese yen 15-minute chart. It's a simpler example because everything in this scenario occurs by the book, meaning that nothing too unexpected could throw us off and makes us miss the great opportunity that presented itself after the manipulation. Without further ado, let's jump right into the analysis itself. As you can see, I don't have a lot of information in the chart. Sometimes all you need to produce a high-quality analysis is a few major market vectors. You don't need to be looking too far back in price because the market does not have that much of a memory, and you will not be able to keep track of the immense amount of details anyway. As far as I'm concerned, this is a paradigm where everyone benefits, which is not usual because traders usually have to deal with uncomfortable realities. From number 1 to number 3, we can clearly see that the market created a lower low and a lower high. This is undeniable. For those of you who are desperately seeking for objective truths about price, this is one of them right here. Number 3 is lower than number 1, and this means that sellers from number 2 seem to be stronger than the buyers. When price breaks low number 1 to the downside, number 2 becomes a solid market structure. The difference between fractal flow students and the traders that are still trapped in shallow mentalities about the market is that we understand the subtle games that can be played on the chart, and we do not act by impulse. We investigate to reach the truth of the market. Any high or low is always a potential manipulation axis, so we have to carefully observe how price gets in these levels, and how it behaves when it gets there. Once again, we have to put ourselves in the shoes of retail traders. When price starts to rise after low 3, retail traders are immediately attracted to the high number 2. They see it as a good place to put a buy order. There is an interesting phenomenon going on here. The way human perception works is quite complicated, and we tend to think that we see a piece of information and then we infer its utility. That's not the case at all. We first see the utility, and then we infer the information itself. In other words, when retail traders look at the high number 2, they first see it as a place to go long because that's the way they think all the time. They are not actually seeing the high number 2 for what it is. They see what they want to see before they see things for what they really are. That's a major problem in the financial markets. Luckily for you and me, we are aware this sort of thing happens, so we can anticipate it. When price approaches high number 2, it starts to increase its volatility. This is the von Restorff effect happening in this example. When this happens, retail traders are sure they are correct about their long orders in high number 2. This creates a cluster of orders in the high number 2. Large traders are obviously well aware of that, so they will attempt to poke that cluster of orders to create a deep liquidity pool. You could wonder why large traders do that. They don't do that out of pure evil or malevolence. They have to create deep liquidity pools in order to get in the market with large positions at the same time that they don't distort price too much. That's basically a way to sneak in large trades in the market. It turns out that they must do this at the expense of the retail traders. That's exactly what happens in number 4. Observe that candle 4 pokes the high number 2 and closes below that level. Observe also the size of the upper tail of candle 4. The cluster of orders was triggered, then a deep liquidity pool was created, and the market depth increased significantly. This was the opportunity for large traders to assume the opposite position of retail traders, which in this case is a massive short position. This is basically large traders pushing retail traders off the cliff. Right after candle 4, retail traders are desperate or stopped out, so the reverse psychology begins. They suddenly realize that they did not consider the possibility that they could be incorrect about their upward market bias. This is reverse psychology because retail traders are led to one direction with the sole objective of being led to the opposite direction right after. The bandwagon effect is what follows the reverse psychology because retail traders become eager to recuperate their losses. What matters the most for us here in this course is that while all of this is happening, price will float around these important levels and it will give us opportunities to take a ride along the large traders. As you can see, I drew a black wash line and a red sloped wash line in the chart. Observe how nicely the red sloped wash line catches the frequency of the upper tails of the candles around number 4. Regardless of the line you choose to use as an entry method or the type of trigger that you decide to use in your trade, the stop loss is in the same area, and it should protect you in any case. The level of our stop loss would be above the high number 4, which was indeed the manipulation itself. The trade you see in the chart was opened when price touched the red sloped wash line for the 5th time. The target was placed at the low number 3 to give me a 1-to-3 risk-reward ratio. Let's see how the trade turns out. As you can see here, the market hit our target successfully, rendering our analysis as correct. In this lecture we are going to analyze a simple manipulation maneuver in the Australian dollar 1-hour timeframe. This example is a little different because the von Restorff effect seems to be absent, at least in the way it usually appears on most market manipulations. However, we have other strong elements that point to the validity of the manipulation in question. Let's jump into the analysis to see what's going on in this chart. Just by looking at the chart we can tell that the market has been rising, and therefore we have an upward motion. You can argue that this is a very vague way of establishing the trend, and you would be correct, but remember that retail traders think in this simplistic manner. One of the things you must be able to do is to put yourself in the shoes of the retail traders. When they see a chart like this, they are thinking about going long for sure. That's certainly the case when retail traders find themselves around low number 2. When they are around that level, they are immediately attracted to high number 1 because they cannot help to think that 1 is a good place to go long. Naturally, large masses of retail traders think exactly the same thing simultaneously. This creates a cluster of long orders at the high number 1 level. As I said in the beginning, the von Riestorff effect is absent here in its most obvious form. Maybe not absent in general, but we don't have any large candles shooting up near the high 1 after the low 2 occurred. We do have something interesting though, which is the pounding of lows right before high number 1 was broken in 3. Take a look at the series of green upward arrows I drew in the chart. Right before price broke the high 1 in candle 3, we can see a price signature. All that means is that large traders were deliberately pounding those lows to tilt the market up to high 1. Notice how those tails have a certain degree of order between them. They don't seem to be random at all, and that's because they are not. The fact that large traders had to pound those candles up means that there was already a lot of selling pressure in this market. Maybe that would explain the lack of an obvious von Riestorff effect, and also the fact that high 1 was just slightly poked. Candle 3 is what does the trick for the large traders. The high of candle 3 pokes the cluster of orders created by retail traders. That by itself creates a deep liquidity pool and increases the market depth of that market level naturally. This is the moment where large traders can sneak in their massive positions, which in this case would be for the selling side. You can tell that by the size of the upper tail in the candle 3. After candle 3 closed, the retail traders are already stopped out or very worried. Here the reverse psychology and bandwagon effect begin to take place in that way that must be boring you by now. Retail traders suddenly realize that they were probably mistaken about their long trade idea, and they are starting to take the reverse position to recuperate their losses. It's amazing to see how they never learn their lesson and they keep making the same mistakes repeatedly. Since large traders are already holding a sell position, the fact that retail traders are also jumping into the selling side only helps drive the market down and make money for the large traders. If retail traders had some degree of discipline and were able to hold their positions, they could in fact make their money back, but they lack operational ethics, so they usually close their positions as soon as they see some profit in the terminal. A really bad case of hyperbolic discounting to say the least. After candle 3 is closed, we already have the correct context for a trade based on our analysis. Observe that I drew a black horizontal wash line and a red sloped wash line. Notice how many times price tests the sloped wash line inside the red rectangle I drew. That's a very strong indication that this is the line we should be looking at. After candle 3 closed, we had 2 chances to go short in the red sloped wash line when price touched it. The position you see in this chart was opened at the second and last chance before price started falling, which is marked by the second red arrow. The stop is above the high of the candle that was used to manipulate the market as usual, and the target is a low that is apparently significant in the chart. Let's see how the market develops. As you can see here, our analysis of the market was correct and our target was successfully hit. This is the type of trades and the type of precision you can have once you master the way large traders think. In this lecture we are going to analyze a trade that happened in the British pound versus the US dollar in the 15-minute timeframe. This is a good example of one of those scary and counterintuitive trades to take because of the violence of the movements involved. Oftentimes in trading you will find yourself under the necessity of gauging your rationality and your natural impulses. This can be difficult in a situation like the one we are about to see in this example. There is nothing special about the way this manipulation occurred in this chart. As usual, we can observe price creating its natural flow downwards from number 1 to number 4. As you can notice, the market vectors are quite large, and it's easy to see that we are dealing with the major flow. From number 4 to number 5 is where things start to shift a little bit, but in a very subtle way despite the size of the movements. This is somewhat of a paradoxical message. At the same time that price is subtly changing its dynamics, it is producing wild and volatile movements. Most traders only notice the second part of this message, of course, because they have not trained themselves to perceive the subtleties of price action. I say that price started to change its behavior from 4 to 5 because price was able to climb up exactly to high number 3. This is a sign of strength of buyers in a downward market. It does not mean that buyers are dominant yet, but it does mean that they are stronger than they were previously. If that was not the case, the buyers would simply fail to create an extreme as high as number 5. That's the first clue that you should pick up in this chart. The second clue, which should be obvious to you at this point, is the combination of a price signature and the von Riestorff effect in its obvious form in the market vector from 5 to 6. Observe how price falls hard after 5 and also how every candle creates a lower high, meaning that large traders were probably trying to pound the high of every candle to produce the von Riestorff effect. Meanwhile, the retail traders are looking at the vector between 5 and 6 and they are certain that low number 4 is an awesome place to trigger a sell trade. After all, just look at how violent the sellers are in the way down from 5. This is an illusion, of course. In candle number 6, price pokes the low number 4, triggering the cluster of orders that was lying around. This is of course performed by large traders who deliberately push retail traders off the cliff here. By triggering the cluster of orders, a deep liquidity pool is created, and the market depth increases significantly. This is where large traders can open their large positions, which in this case would be a long position. All of those suspiciously large lower tails after candle 6 are nothing more than large traders entering and re-entering long positions to tilt the market to the upside now. At this point, the retail traders are really upset because their trade idea is not working at all. This is where ape-like behavior starts to kick in and survival mode lights up in the brain of retail traders, so they naturally try to reverse the position to the upside out of pure desperation. This is how the reverse psychology part of the manipulation is successfully employed, and it's immediately followed by the bandwagon effect. Candle number 6 poses a few different opportunities for people like us who understand the underlying mechanics of market makers. Observe that I drew a few lines in there. Let's discuss them a little bit to see what could have been done and why. The first and most obvious line is the blue wash line that has its origin in the low number 4. As you can see, after number 6 price action came back to this line one more time. This could have been used as a trigger point, and it would be a precise one. The other line we have is the red frequency line that catches the frequency of the lower tails of lows 4 and 6. Price tests this line 4 times around low number 6 using the frequency discovered in the lower tails of low number 4. You have 3 different chances to trigger a long trade after the candle 6 if you were to use the red frequency line. The third line, and perhaps the most difficult to draw, is the green sloped wash line. To be able to draw this line with this angle, we need at least the candle after candle 6 to catch the sloped frequency. After that, price touched the green line one more time up to this point. The trade you see opened in the chart was triggered when price touched the green sloped wash line for the first time, as it is indicated in the green arrow. The stop loss is naturally placed below low number 6, and the target is placed at high number 5. Let's see how the market develops. As you can see here, the manipulative process was successfully identified and it produced a very nice long trade opportunity. In this lecture we are going to study a complex manipulation example that happened in the euro versus the Swiss franc 30-minute timeframe. It's a complex example because it involves more than one low being manipulated, which creates the necessity of paying close attention to the details of candlesticks once they reach certain levels in the chart. Without further ado, let's begin the analysis to unpack the details of this market. From numbers 1 to 4 we have the market creating major higher highs and higher lows. We can also see that number 1 and number 3 are solid market structures because price has clearly broken them with full force, meaning that there is no question about the fact they were broken. After number 4, price starts to fall right into solid structure number 3 to create low number 5. Clearly there was a lot of buying pressure still remaining at that level, so price created a bump up to create high number 6. This is the first subtle clue in the chart. Notice that in number 5 the market goes back to the level 3, which was the origin of the market vector between 3 and 4. However, after number 5 price was only capable of going as high as number 6, which shows that buying pressure was not that great anymore. The real problem of this chart really begins right after high number 6. Notice that from that point onwards we can see the signs of organized behavior. That should be the first red flag to you if you are thinking about selling the market. At this point, retail traders are thinking exactly that. They see that number 6 failed to go higher than 4, and perhaps most importantly, they see price falling down in a neatly organized way after 6. The immediate response in the minds of retail traders is to sell lows number 5 and number 3, which are the most obvious lows in the chart at that point. Price goes down and pokes these two lows in what I described as the first poke. Observe that this first poke pierces lows number 3 and 5, but it ends up closing above both of them like a good manipulation always does. The problem here is that price starts to go up a little bit, and then it starts to do down in an organized behavior again after the first poke. This can mean only one thing for the market makers. The order cluster that was sitting around lows number 3 and 5 was not large enough to create the effect they needed. The natural solution to the large traders' problem here is to poke the next lows to trigger other cluster of orders. Notice that the first poke creates a new low, which is poked right after in what I called the second poke. Once again, price pierces down the first poke and it closes above it. Price also ends up piercing the low number 1 and closing above it. This means that a total of 3 lows were poked and many sell orders were triggered. Market makers now have the necessary amount of opposite position to continue their agenda. The key here was to identify that second leg of the organized behavior. That should tell you that this sort of thing can happen, and market makers can get surprised also when they see that the order cluster they were originally targeting is not enough for their tricks. Right after the third poke, price action creates a textbook perfect inside candle that has small volatility. This is a sign at this point that market makers are done poking those lows in this repetitive manner, but be careful, because that's not the interpretation of an inside candle by itself. It's the interpretation of this particular inside candle, in this specific situation and in this specific context. Don't try to find any inside candles on your chart and apply this same interpretation to them, because that's going to fail for reasons that should be obvious to you at this point in the course. The position you see in the chart was triggered at the very next candle open. The stop loss was placed below the solid structure number 1, and the target was placed at high number 4 to give us a very nice risk-reward ratio. Let's see how the market turns out. As you can see here, the natural order of the tridimensional axis of market manipulations resumed after the inside candle that was used as a trigger for our trade, and the market went up significantly, rendering our trade idea as a winner.